Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're talking about 4 years in the Discourse, and the timing couldn't be more perfect because in many ways this event marks the chaotic end of a long journey in which we have been watching from the sidelines and commenting on hopelessly for, in your case, 15 years, in my case, 20. My political career begins and ends with it. Well, maybe ends with Afghanistan.
I think.
Go ahead.
I think, Derek. I don't know. The war on terror, as I was telling you off air, was. It was I think it was a catalyzing moment for both of us. But I didn't even let you finish your introduction.
Well, I mean, it's the end of this period of the American Empire, where the crumbling, and when I say that, I say it advisedly, actually, because the crumbling implies that it's collapsing or that U.S. military hegemony is weak, or something like that. And that's not really what's going on. I think this, the Afghan war transferred trillions of dollars from public coffers into private hands. It completely changed the dynamic of the left. And yet, until this week, most people I know had long since given up even fucking talking about it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I almost got into an argument with Doug Lane today because he was talking about how useless the Afghan war peace movement was. And I pointed out that I thought the boomer peace movement was also useless. And he was like, well, the state was afraid of civil unrest in the U.S. And I'm like, no, they were losing to the People's Army. I don't know how much domestic politics actually had to do with it, except that the actual spirit of drafty soldiers was just not there anymore. But believe it or not, the Vietnam War was more popular throughout its existence than the Afghan War was after 2003.
I was going to say, you may agree or disagree with this, but I always have arguments with especially people around Pennsylvania who are older and much more conservative than I am, but we'll argue about Vietnam sometimes. And I always get, this happens at the turkey dinner with some of the stranger relatives I have, who at this point I don't even see anymore because that's how horribly polarized we are, I guess, or whatever. But, we would always have these arguments about Vietnam. And I always like bringing up, at this point, I bring it up whenever I can when I talk about Vietnam. People always tell me it was the limousine liberals and Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda and the Hollywood anti-war types. I'm like, not really. It was just, I don't think the U.S. was going to beat the peasant farmers, and I don't think I don't think we learned that lesson.
Yeah. The U.S. wasn't going to beat the peasant farmers unless it was willing to completely eradicate them, which it had the capacity to do. But how do you rule or even justify colonial rule over an area that you've turned to glass? And we didn't not bomb the shit out of it. I mean, it's something about the weird asymmetry that has developed in modern warfare. Mm-hmm. You and I both come out of, anti-war conservative circles.
Yes. Well, let's talk about that if we could. So for you, where does it start? You actually, and I'm not trying to take over your show, but I'm always curious to hear more about it, is you sort of came out of those, I would say the sort of Pat Buchanan, like anti-war.
Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, do you want to maybe give a rundown of that? And then I would like to give my rundown of how I felt about the whole war on terror and how I got into it.
there was a left opposition to the war on terror when I was in college, but it was actually smaller than people remember. They tend to remember the post 2003, 2004, up to the midterm elections anti-war movement. They don't actually remember the period right after 9/11 where Bush had like a 90% approval rate. When I knew gutter punk anarchists who all of a sudden became Islamophobes.
It was a bad. I don't think people realize how bad it was. Like if
Yeah.
you spoke out after 9/11, like you were a pariah. You were a pariah. So
I went on during the lead up to the Afghan war, I went on a local news there in Milledgeville, right? And I said something about the war being would be a horrendous, unnecessary, expensive money, and since there would be nothing to rebuild afterwards, it won't be like World War II. That this idea that war was a profit-making venture only made sense in certain contexts, and actually now I have a much more coherent, worked out reason for why that's true. But at the time, it was just kind of an innate well, it's expensive to blow shit up, and once you blow stuff up, it's gone. So I don't know how you could possibly make money off that if you're not also rebuilding it afterwards, and you're not gonna be because you don't want this area to have the kind of infrastructure that you have. Clearly, because because they never did. Even in the Korean War, all right, the U.S. trained people to speak Korean. They went out and found Koreans. Now, yes, there were Pasu interpreters in Afghanistan, but most of the brass never bothered to even learn the fucking language. And that was clear really early on, before even the Iraq war, but everyone thought the Afghan war was okay, and it was even liberal popular opinion, through the Obama period, with some occasional liberals who were former conservatives like Gary Wills really chastising Obama for not also following through with pulling out of Afghanistan. But Wills always seemed to me like he didn't listen to what Obama was saying. Like Obama was doing exactly what he said he was going to do. And yet it's also true that anti-war sentiment put Obama in the office. I think that plus the economic crisis, it was a 1-2 punch. People forget how conservative this country felt in 2007, 2008. Even looking at voter statistics, right? I was arguing with somebody today about millennials, and I said millennials used to be a lot more conservative. They before 2006. Yes, when they first started voting, they were slightly more democratic than on margin, I think by 2 or 3%. But the idea of the super liberal millennial is a post-recession, post-Obama development. It's wild. And so you're hearing me get mad because I have years of pent-up anger at this left, right? And I give the story all the time. I went to Sea Island to protest a G8 and protest this war. I think it was 2002, 2003. I can't remember exactly when it was. It was right after the Iraq war started. I told the story about how the person who was going with me bailed to go see Suicide Girls. Morally, I'm still deeply sickened by it. But when I actually think about what the anti-war movement did, maybe he was right. We went down there and I encountered International Answer, who was doing the normal. Now they've since become more and more officially Marxist-Leninists, but at the time they were technically Trotskyists in the leadership. It was like the ISO and the PSL and the WWP before the PSL split from it. But they were doing the whole Trot thing, like critical support for, full military support for the Taliban, full military support for Al Qaeda, which even to my anti-war ears and someone was just like, what? Like that seems to be an absurd way, even if you believe in revolutionary defeatism, from the Leninist perspective of 1917, the context is different. There's no way, it doesn't actually endanger the fundamentals of the core of empire. Still doesn't. But that, even if you believe that, stating that way is just, it seems completely alienating, particularly when you're in the South, right? And so the people who talked more sense to me,
real quick, not only that, but like, so I was reading Stephen Zuna's letter that he wrote, or it was an article or a letter he wrote about, why we shouldn't invade Afghanistan. He wrote it the day after 9/11. And he's one of the better foreign policy people out there, right? But, it's eerie reading it back, because he's like, you're going to invade, and we don't necessarily have to like the Taliban. We don't have to like Al-Qaeda, et cetera, et cetera. But the Taliban, they will run the hills. They'll run to the mountain outposts. They'll run to their bunkers. The only people that are going to suffer from this war are the Afghan people. And this is actually going to cause more nationalistic sentiments. It's going to actually embolden hardline nationalism in Afghanistan, and possibly support for the Taliban. Yeah, go on.
Which we should have seen, because we used that ourselves with the Soviet-aligned government in Afghanistan in the 80s, which, I say with a double-edged sword, because there's a lot of people now who are taking a very pro that period of that's a heroic Afghan war as opposed to the dumb one that we fought. But I would say that there is a real sense in which the Soviet-aligned government of Afghanistan had more popular legitimacy in the cities than we do, or did. For a variety of reasons, one of which is just they had infrastructure, but it also produced, through the same hardening of nationalism, the consolidation of different religious groups, the consolidation of different ethnic groups, because Afghanistan is a very tribal region.
But what I was trying to get at, though, Derek, was I think you were going to say that, there were some people on the left that were saying, oh, we need critical support for the Taliban, which is kind of odd to hear in hindsight, because the Taliban was always going to sort of wait it out. The right. People that were always going to get hit by the war were just the average people in Afghanistan. I mean, they're the true victims of this.
Yeah. I mean, plus the spiraling it sent through the Middle East, it wasn't just the U.S. that began wars on terror really escalating in this time period also, that we need to remember.
But I was going to say, you were going to say, so you were more drawn to the conservative voices. Let's get into that, because when I got into this pretty young. I think by the time I was in middle school, I was reading antiwar.com, and admittedly, I was reading Lou Rockwell at the time. My God. Oh,
me too. And when you were in middle school would have been when I was actually doing this.
Yeah.
We're 10 years difference in age. So
who were the people you were drawn to with regards to the sort of conservative and libertarian voices that were speaking out against the war, and why are you drawn to them? Because I think I was more drawn to them too, and I think they had a very different approach talking about the war on terror than a lot of people on the left did.
For one, they weren't politically opportunist. Their stance on this, and it's funny because leftists see it as political opportunism now. Their stance on this may have been motivated by deep cultural chauvinism in a lot of cases. That's absolutely true. Fear of backwards planet motivated a lot of those people. It doesn't, but they actually were taking a stand against the party of which their immediate interests were supposedly aligned. And the Democrats and the left adjacent to the Democrats were all over the fucking map depending on the day. And they seem to have no appeal to people outside of tiny sectarian milieus, despite the fact that where I lived more people were involved in that stupid war than where most of the big anti-war protests actually were. And the people that came back from that, and I taught them at a military college, were more damaged and more resentful of the war, even as early as 2003, 2004, than what I saw the liberal, what was a liberal left back then with some Marxist elements in charge of some very disparate groups doing. And I remember Scott Horton in 2007, and by this point I'd already lost my belief in paleoconservatism.
You need to get Scott on the show at some point, by the way.
Yeah, which one? There's two, and they're both good on the Afghan war.
Well, that's true. You know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Scott Horton, radio host extraordinaire.
Right. As someone's asking here, did Varn call the support for the Mujahideen the heroic Afghan war? Was that sarcastic? No, I wasn't calling support for the Mujahideen. I was calling support for the Soviet government the heroic Afghan war, and as opposed to the current one. The support the U.S. gave to the Mujahideen was the basis for a lot of what they're fighting now. However, a lot of that anger at the Soviet-aligned government was real, because often tied to developmentalist policies with nomadic tribal peoples, frankly. So it's something that I think people really have to look at. They have to look at that. They have to look at Pakistan's involvement in all this and non-involvement in all this and the various stuff that happened there too. And when I read left-wing critiques in the early aughts, when most of you were probably in middle school, I didn't hear any of that. When I read antiwar.com or LouRockwell.com, which was given to me by people who would go to this protest, who seemed to be from my community, who didn't seem like they were, college punkers. Some of them were punks. I mean, but they didn't seem, they weren't talking Derrida and Marx in a very vapid way. I mean, mentioning Jameson and stuff. I mean, I do all that now too, but it was very alienating to me, particularly after going to the G8 protest in 1998, and then wondering why those same people who showed up in 1998 under Clinton, but were like terrified seemingly of the war on terror, or if they really cared, why didn't they come down to the South and show up at Sea Island, which they didn't. Like, there was almost no one in that protest. We were in a little protest cage. Like, no one was there. I mean, people forget about this. And it's been funny because they hear about how radicalized everyone got under Trump.
Well, I was going to say, too, it's funny because I keep talking to more and more people who, I've always said this to people, but I went from like a Ron Paul guy to going to the left, but my interest in Ron Paul was always the foreign policy stuff. I remember when I remember when he was doing the presidential debates and Giuliani was, yelling at him saying, you need to apologize. You're saying that it's our fault for 9/11 because Ron Paul would talk about blowback. So I looked at that and I was like, screw you, Giuliani. You're a ghoul, right? Ron Paul is right. I mean, blowback's the thing.
The American Empire Project, right? You remember that? Like the people trying to expose that. And while it had a lot of leftists and liberals on it, I mean, Chomsky was part of it too. The more cohesive people were like Chambers Johnson and stuff. And they started out, a lot of them that abandoned their paleoconservative.
It's sort of like Vidal, right? Because people forget this about Gore Vidal, but Vidal would always say that he was a man of the old right, which right. I think there's truth to that. I don't think Vidal was just pulling people's legs.
I mean, read his book, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, where he has a soft spot for Timothy McVeigh.
I have that book. I'm very fond of that book, despite the McVeigh bit. But I guess what I was getting at is I know a lot of people that they would be loath to admit it publicly now, but a lot of people I know on the left that started out as Ron Paul anti-war types, but then moved to the left. I feel like people are embarrassed by that now, but I think there was a coherency to the sort of, I hate that word paleocon, but people like Justin Raimondo, I think, were very much, there was something coherent about their critique of the war on terror. And even someone like Pat Buchanan, like, people would ask me, well, why was Pat Buchanan against the war on terror in a lot of ways? And I'm like, because he didn't view terrorism as an existential threat the way he did communism. So all these people that viewed communism as an existential threat that needed to be contained, they didn't view terrorism the same way, Islamic terrorism, jihadism. And it made sense to me. I think there was a coherence to what they were saying.
I mean, okay, let's just, I want people to think back to the 70s and just in the 60s and drop our current ideological orientations. Both sides were nuclear armed to the point that we could destroy the world over 4 to 5 times with not a nary bit of life on the surface of the earth surviving. And regardless of our ideological orientation now, and regardless of whether or not we thought the Soviets were justified in that in hindsight because they were being baited by the West, that's a real fear. You know, a dirty bomb in New York City might kill, a whole DSA worth of people. But that's nothing compared to a nuclear armed war. But you know what's funny? Is Pat Buchanan, around the middle of this time period, started openly doubting if the anti-communism was worth it. And I say this as a person who has totally been turned off by that politics for a variety of reasons. But I'm having all this, I'm almost having flashbacks to my 20s now because I just remember being alone in this for a long time. I mean, the Afghan war had 70% approval.
Right. But not only were we alone, and I think people forget this. People talk about how dangerous the Trump era was. It was so dangerous. I'm sorry, but the Bush era was that was traumatic for a lot of people. In its own way. Not to use the therapeutic language, they're traumatic, but it was not a good time to speak out. And I'm sorry I keep going back to that, but I think people forget. If you were against the wars during the Bush era, especially the early part, you were, it was, what was the line he had? You're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
Yeah, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
It was very bad. And you would get attacked hard if you question things.
I mean, the jingoistic patriotism was greater than another Trump, as was talk of American exceptionalism. And
you had a lot of people that just fell in line. Even people that were ostensibly leftists became, super patriots, as Michael Parente would call them.
For the first 2 or 3 years, yeah. I mean, by 2004, that had run off. That had worn off. I was asked, the other day in a private forum, why the U.S. military is so popular still, despite the fact that these wars haven't been. Basically since 2003, definitely since 2006.
Well, what do we mean when we say the U.S. military, though?
I mean, troops are popular. Even the institution of the U.S. military is still broadly trusted. And, I think people also forget the infrastructure of the United States in a lot of the places that aren't fucking Brooklyn and California. That military and Keynesianism, until relatively recently, supported a whole lot of the economies of these regions. It was a very real, it was both a core of the foot soldiers for empire and a consolidation for internal imperialism in the United States itself. And it had been that way for a long time, but it really accelerated under the Bush administration. And a lot of our culture war stuff that has come back since the middle of the Obama period was all put on halt. All right. Complaining about PC culture run amok stopped for a while. When someone as kind of banal as Greg Palast went to a university campus in 2002, a liberal university, is in Georgia, admittedly. It wasn't not even Greg Palast. It's the Patch Adams guy told people to read a Greg Palast book about the war, right? Fairly anodyne liberal book that was anti-war. Patch Adams, Dr. Famous from the Robin Williams movies of only a few years before, was booed off stage by students multiple times. When I hear about the last 4 years and how traumatized it's been, I have often felt, and I've made this known, that while there is a sense that there's a revanchist mood in the country and a kind of nationalism is coming back to the United States. Totally true. There's also a sense, and that frankly, Trump didn't do much to dismantle the American empire. Even if he wanted to, it was such a low priority.
Even if he wanted to, though, he wouldn't have known how to do it.
Right.
That's what I always tell people. I'm really sick of.
Yeah.
Well, go on. I was going to say, I'm really sick of this line. And I even see some, I don't even know if they're leftists anymore, but people that used to be considered leftists, they'll say, well, Trump wanted to stop all these wars. And, he just couldn't outmaneuver the deep state. And I'm like, well, that's his problem. Why wasn't he able to do that? It's because he was inexperienced and didn't, even if he wanted to. And I actually do think Trump had certain inclinations towards a more restrained foreign policy, but he has no experience in DC. And I think this, to be honest, I think it was a problem with Obama. Obama put people in power like Ben Rhodes, who I think actually, now I'm not saying Rhodes was like a radical when it came to foreign policy. He's the one that coined the term the blob, though. And I think he had some issues with the foreign policy consensus, or what I believe Obama called the DC playbook, right? But I don't think Obama or Trump, both of them, even if they had inclinations of trying to change the foreign policy consensus, they didn't know how to do it.
I mean, yeah. I don't know that they have that many inclinations. Obama had some, but Obama was focused on Iraq, a war that is both technically over and we've technically left, but we haven't left it, not particularly not in the way that we left Afghanistan. The thing I think we have to remember is that there was a consolidation of one faction of conservatives that began under Reagan that really accelerated under a Bush. And the thing about that faction of conservatives, we call them neocons.
Are we talking about the neocons?
Okay. Yes, of course we are. We call them neocons, which is kind of misleading now because they're not that new anymore. And they also have abandoned a lot of their social platform planks. Like they were okay with a whole lot of the welfare state and this, that, and the other, as long as we had a warfare state to go with it.
Well, I hate to say it, but and I think we've talked about this before, but if you read enough about neocons, if you read the paleocon interpretation of neocons, they're not wrong about everything. Like in a lot of ways, I think neocons were more or less liberal superhawks.
Yeah, they were. A lot of them. I mean, their ideological consensus came out of a bunch of former socialists, both Trotskyists and Social Democrat, and a few Maoists actually, although that's often forgotten. People, when the New Left faded, who took a particularly anti-communist stance, and then they took a particularly expansive stance towards American hegemony abroad in a way that in retrospect seems absurd. Not like for example, the left at the time also couldn't get its mind around certain things. Like I remember arguing with people about blood for oil. This very simple narrative that a lot of populist leftists had once the anti-war movement had become a broadly left position, the liberal left position. I mean, and again, people forget that before Occupy, Marxists were a super tiny minority of a super tiny minority of a super tiny minority, not just a tiny minority. All right. Instead of 100,000 or 400,000 people in a population of 320 million, we were like 10,000 in a population of 310 million. And
which may explain why we had to work with some of these like libertarians like a Raimondo or even a paleocon like Pat Buchanan. I think you were involved in one of Pat Buchanan's anti-war things, right?
Kinda. I mean, indirectly. I wasn't ever a member of any organization. I did give money to antiwar.com. I worked with people to get antiwar.com messaging out throughout the early aughts. And even when go ahead.
I was going to say, I guess my point was just that, and I feel like this is going to become a problem again. I have a line I will draw with who I think you can do coalitions with, limited sort of tactical coalitions. Like I don't want to launch anything like that. I don't want to work with the alt-right. But I think when it comes to issues like, say, the war on drugs or the war on terror, foreign policy restraint, the only way the left is such a minority that I think you have to work with libertarians and conservative elements. You have to build coalitions. And I think that's being forgotten again.
It's not. I don't know that it's being forgotten. I don't know that it's ever been something leftists have been inclined to do. They barely fucking.
I was going to say maybe we never learned that lesson.
But also I don't know that it's the right lesson to fucking learn, because when you're talking about making coalitions with other political minority groups, that makes sense if either side has power. The ultimate truth, though, of the last 20 years is that the peace movement didn't do shit. Didn't do a goddamn thing. Conservative or liberal. It didn't. All right. What I found even more amazing about it is that if you talk to people who are more involved than even I was, is that a lot of these peace groups just gave up on their mission. Particularly with Obama, they started getting into other forms of NGO service because it was easier to get money. All right? It's just the truth. The far left emergence happened after that capitulation had almost all happened, and it frankly happened when foreign policy wasn't really part of the deal. All right? Go back and think about Occupy. How much did foreign policy come up? We were at war.
No, absolutely.
I mean, and all these people celebrating about Afghanistan now, and I don't want to like shit on their parade.
Well, it's so weird because like someone said to me recently, Adam Fitzgerald of the Darkened Hour podcast, which is really, really good, like history of 9/11 podcast that really, it aggravates both truthers and hawks. So it's a good podcast. But he said, wow, it's crazy. After what happened in Afghanistan the past few days, everyone just came out of the woodwork and apparently thinks they're John Pilger now. Like, it's true though. And I understand your aggravation about it.
I'm angry. It's interesting because I thought I would be elated, and you said you were, today. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that it's over. I really am. And I think this one really is. I think our involvement in Afghanistan, the way it has been for the last 20 years, really is over.
I do want to comment on that because there's a really great piece by Patrick Coburn in The Independent where he's like, well, the forever war isn't really over for Afghanistan. There's still going to be a lot of issues Afghanistan faces. It's just that the U.S. is out of it now.
No, I mean, it's probably going to be a proxy battleground between India and fucking China.
Yeah.
I mean, like, this is not going to be some grand humanitarian gesture. Don't let, and neither would going back in be. I mean, oh my God, if I hear anyone complain about, we went there to educate women and girls, which is crazy revisionism. People can beat off to the Cali runner if they want to, but I mean, what gets me about this, right, is like the interest in foreign policy to me I bet you if I had an aggregate to track tweets, foreign policy becoming an issue for the left again is like directly correlated to the Bernie campaign failing. I bet. I can almost put money on it. And I don't want to be that cynical, but my God, it's hard not to be. And it's not that Bernie had bad positions in regards to, I mean, he didn't have perfect positions in regards to foreign policy, but definitely better than anybody else in the milieu, including a lot of, not all, but a lot of the squad.
Well, there was that whole the F-35 boondoggle in
Right.
Vermont with him, but I mean that's the weird thing about politics too. Like everyone on some level that's really involved with the national political scene, I mean they're compromised in some way, right? Like, Bernie did that because it was good for Vermont. He didn't want to lose votes.
But what's interesting about the left and foreign policy, right? Even now, its foreign policy commentary is cheerleading for countries that it has and should have very little involvement in. While I'm all about solidarity networks and stuff with people in Latin America, the U.S. needs to be, including U.S. leftists, just need to be very fucking careful about how they intervene because of the history of the Monroe Doctrine, etc.
That's why I always tell people I'm more just drawn to this sort of I use the word restraint-based foreign policy now. I feel like that's the sort of middle road where you're not supporting any side in some conflict. You're just saying we need to be very careful with what we do foreign policy wise with our interventions, and we don't have to like take sides.
But there's this whole other context that's still going on. That we've seen this Cold War footing that a lot of the progressives, not the left, but the progressives in the Democratic Party are becoming more and more sanguine with in regards to China. That even fairly liberal people who are not big CCP or CPC, depending on what pedant wants me to use a certain order of acronym. What we're seeing is not a whole lot to do with that whatsoever. We've seen more and more involvement in foreign policy in ways that, I mean, it's a fucking spectator sport. Like, it's not even places where the U.S. is directly acting, and at the same time, there's been a kind of blindness to things like the pivot to Asia, which began a decade ago.
Yeah, that started with Obama. I mean, that started with that was Brzezinski's big thing. Yeah.
Right. Things like AFRICOM initiatives, which have taken a less bellicose but still pretty active role. I mean, it's very disheartening because I said for years, and people, I have someone screaming about it, that the left didn't want to take about foreign policy anymore. And I was right. And I still don't really think it does. I mean, like, this is another thing. Like, what I see projected into this is like, okay, for example, I'm getting all these people who didn't know a week ago. I'm almost promising until Bashar Sankara looked it up that the post-Soviet aligned government in Afghanistan survived longer than the USSR did by a year. But what they're not saying about that was confined only to the cities. So now people have woken up and learning all these facts that they didn't fucking know for 20 goddamn years. And then they don't know them right now because they're using them to paint a narrative about the left or Soviet legitimacy or something like that, to which I have no stakes. All right. And they don't really understand it. And like, I know that I don't understand a lot of this, and I understand a lot of it a lot better than most by the books leftists. And yeah, if you feel called out by it, it's because I am. Because I've been saying just for years that I can't get leftists to care about foreign policy anymore. I can't bring it. Everyone wanted, you remember a few months ago, all people wanted to talk about was either electoralism, AOC, and Medicare for all, or fucking theory.
Well, then there's like the incidents where everyone wants to talk about foreign policy for like a week, like when Soleimani got assassinated, and everyone talks about it for like 3 days, and then everything goes back to like Medicare for all, you know.
And it's going to happen with this in Afghanistan. It's going to.
Yeah. Which that's the really sad thing for me is, you know, I feel really bad for I know people that thought we shouldn't withdraw, like Edward Girardet, who's been covering Afghanistan since the 70s when a lot of the fighting really started picking up there. And he told like O'Reilly back right before we were going to invade, you may want to rethink this. Like maybe we shouldn't invade. And even though and I've talked to him before, but even though he was against a full withdrawal. He wanted to get military out of there, but he wanted to have some like NATO troops and stuff there. I'm still sympathetic to him in so much as he was one of the only people saying maybe we shouldn't have done any of this in the first place. And the more we talk about it, the more I see why you're frustrated, because as much as I think a withdrawal was necessary, I also don't know that anyone's learning any lessons from this.
Inevitable. It was inevitable.
Yeah.
And frankly, like if you've been listening to the news, even back to the end of Obama's tenure, everyone has known the moment the U.S. steps out, which was also inevitable, that the Taliban was going to take over. There have been secret negotiations with the Taliban since at least 2014, and they weren't that secret because you could read in the New York Times a few months after they happened that they happened. Okay, I got a question that maybe both of us can answer. Then we can pivot to the cultural part of this, and I can quit ranting at you. Like I feel like I'm not even interviewing you. I'm like mad. When you told me today,
you're turning into Howard Bill from Network. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Well, obviously, I'm going to take it. What?
Yeah, I keep going back to that real quick. We'll get into the question, but I keep going back to that movie Network because I always love how Howard Bill, he really wants to change everything. If people haven't seen Network, I'll be quick about this, but see the movie. Howard Bill like wants to change everything. He becomes the mad prophet of the airwaves, right? And he's telling people the truth, right? But they're still just consuming it as entertainment. It's still the spectacle. So he still can't win, right? Like he's trying to get people off their asses and he still can't do it. And I often feel that way with the foreign policy stuff. And I think you do too, to some extent.
The truth made him crazy.
Yeah.
Like,
it's like seeing Cthulhu, but go on with the question.
Yeah. Do you feel that any of this has to do with the fact that most foreign policy is a bipartisan matter? Yes. Like the two parties.
It's called the blob.
People have no ability to change anything with votes. Also, yes, because most of it. Okay. Let me give a little civics lesson. One of the ironic turns of history is that the War Powers Act, which was meant to constrain the presidency's ability to use police powers under the UN Charter, which is really the massive expansion of the imperial presidency as far as it can use lethal force abroad, all right, actually created the conditions in its compromise for the presidency to just drop troops in the place and then have Congress fund it later. And of course, Congress is not going to cut off funding to troops that are already on the ground because those troops will get massacred. That was the beginning of this trend. That started after World War II immediately. All right. The War Powers Act is I believe it happened under Eisenhower, and it wasn't an attempt to constrain, the military industrial complex, but it actually set the grounds for the military industrial complex during the post-war social compact, when also people forget this. When also the government could compel a whole lot of involvement in, the Korean War. The Korean War was not super popular. It wasn't. And in fact, opposition to the Vietnam War was actually mostly limited to older people who had fought in the Korean War until the draft expanded in the middle to late 60s. Again, boomer mythology, but like it was mostly silent generation people who in the beginnings of the ramp up of the Vietnam War who opposed it, and then like a few hippies who went to Canada.
It's weird. They're always called the silent generation, but they played a big role in a lot of the. They played a big role in the anti-war movement. They played a big role in civil rights, but we always called them the silent generation. Give all the credit to the boomers.
Right. So
I wanted to add to that real quick. I do think. I mean, there is a reason I always reference Ben Rhodes' whole thing about the blob. I think that's the perfect word for this sort of bipartisan consensus about foreign policy. And, you know, if you want to play ball in DC, as far as I can tell from the people I talk to in DC, you know, you either acquiesce to the blob or you're out. You know, there is a real consensus, I think, within, you know, the heart of the empire, so to speak, about foreign policy. So, yeah, I would say it's a bipartisan thing.
I'm also going to just expand a little bit on what on kind of why this is kind of a big moment, a watershed moment for me, because I want to point out something to people. I am not an anarchist, okay? By no definition, I'm not foolish in this way. But I am highly skeptical of statist versions of socialism. And the reason why is related to the history of the United States. Because almost every expansion of what we call the social safety net in the United States that was not just for something like banking stability or returning profitability to failing sectors was from war. War is the health of the bourgeois state. End of discussion. And the reason why a lot of the left has never been able to take a coherent view of that fact is that they want to believe that the nice parts of the state are not dependent on the ugly parts. And it makes me sometimes, I just bite my tongue when I hear, you know, about communities of care and stuff like that. And yes, of course, I don't have a problem with this, but even in MMT theory, all right, the reason why currency can compel labor is force. So I have thought that, and I've thought in the back of my mind for a long time, that a lot of the theories we see on the left in the capitalist core, not just in the US, seems to be a way to say that you could have your cake and eat it too. That you don't have to actually deal with the real cost of breaking down the empire, and you could maintain all that internally to yourself without admitting that a lot of it is based on trade arbitrage, on the ability to force people into unfair negotiating terms, etc. And when people talk about stuff, I mean, this is the rational core to a lot of like, anti-imperialist complaints about social democracy. That like a lot of the social democratic countries are effective because their defense is outsourced to other countries, and they have great trade leverage by being part of the Transatlantic Pact, whether they protest the U.S. wars or not. So they are, in a very real sense, dependent on the imperial core. I really do sometimes wish that wasn't true, but I see no evidence to the contrary. And so
I was going to say, just to add to that, I mean, I don't think people think about the trade-offs enough when it comes to, I mean, I would like to see, like I said, I believe in, pushing for a more restrained foreign policy. And some people say I have too much hope in think tanks like Quincy or the Center for International Policy and these other groups, Eisenhower Media Network, when it comes to that. Because
that's
I
an
feel like that,
ironically named network, but go ahead.
well, yeah, that's Danny Sherson in that crew. But you're right, it is kind of, yeah. But or the Randolph Bourne Institute, John Quincy Adams. There's a lot of these different think tanks going up. But when I talk to people in those think tanks, there is going to be a trade-off if you have a more restrained foreign policy. Like things in this country will change, and I mean, that's one thing I get confused about with the left. I think there's like, if you want radical change, or you want radical reforms to the system, you may lose certain things that you like in the process, and you have to make decisions about, like, not everything is going to be utopia. You have to make trade-offs.
The other thing that we have to deal with is that with climate change coming and the great movement of the people's coming, which is coming, all right, it's already happening. And I call it the great movement of the peoples because a lot of places are becoming empirically more unstable as resources in the periphery are being taxed by climate, not just by extraction now, but by actual feedback loops that all the developed world, and I'm going to say this, and I want people to listen, including China, all right, are actively engaged in. Now, China is doing more than the U.S. to invest in green technologies and stuff like that. It's true, but it is because of the sheer size of its population, the number one polluter on Earth. We were it for a long time. Europe was it before us. All right. But you combine productive hegemony and that amount of population, and the Chinese aren't. I do not buy any Orientalist stereotypes about the Chinese being, evil or stupid or anything like that. Known to many people in China, actually, to believe that. But they realize they have to invest into green energy just to keep the status quo going. But I don't know that it's going to be good enough for anybody. Why is this relevant to the war on terror?
Can I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
Just it's interesting when the climate change debate comes up, because I was just reading an article in Russ Baker's Who What Why website about Indonesia, and they want to continue economic growth, but they're sort of coming up against a wall now, because they're like, well, if we continue to do growth in this way, that'll contribute to climate change. And it's something that I think Putin brought up when he was asked about Greta Thunberg. He was like, well, I think Greta Thunberg's a nice little girl and all, but these developing nations, go tell them to stop developing. See what they do. They'll laugh at you. I think we're going to face some interesting conundrums when it comes to development and climate change, because I don't know how you're going to tell people to stop developing.
I could already tell that we're losing too many listeners because we're too grimdark today, and I've been in a very grimdark mood lately, and I'm pissing on their happy about Afghanistan parade. And,
I mean, you've totally pissed on my parade, so.
But the thing is, I am happy about Afghanistan. Like, there's that much more people who aren't going to die from this. It's just, it's.
But how happy can we be when who are all the people getting interviewed on the television sets right now? It's right. Not Andrew Bacevich. It's not Eric Margolis. It's not the people who were right from the start. It's not Scott Horton, right? It's not us.
Definitely not.
But we were right from the beginning. And
it's yet, people like Declan Walsh over at the New York Times, who's like an Afghan hawk liberal. I mean, like, it's people like Matt Masters. I got to ask a question, and I think we should answer it. Derek, do you believe the rest working class benefit from empire in the form of cheaper commodities, trade arbitrage? I would say yes, but I don't go as far as like third world as to say that people in the West aren't exploited. They very much are. But you can't, like, you can be both exploitative and benefit from unfair trade practices. Like, that's not hard to conceptually put in your head. I would also say that that it's true that division actually hurts labor across the world, including labor in the developed world. But there's an immediate reason for it. But you also will see that it's harder and harder to maintain. Why do you think? Where did all the jobs go? Like, now there's plenty of jobs, but they're all service jobs and no one wants them. I mean,
where did all the jobs go? Wasn't that the campaign slogan for Ross Perot?
Yeah. It's been something that's been sitting with me for a long time, because, you know, people may have noticed I've been pivoting back to foreign policy for a lot of reasons. Not because I think the U.S. can do much about foreign policy. In fact, I think as a leftist right now, you're looking at a situation where you have to come to terms with the fact that even with a relatively mass eruption in popularity of a candidate you couldn't do shit, and a lot of people who we listened to as elder leftists who guided us through the past, who told us smart things about how bad Obama was, have thrown in the towel and started pimping the center of the Democratic Party all of a sudden. And with no discernible way to do it. Although I will say, in a way, we are at a Nixon to China moment, because only a hawk, which Joe Biden has historically been, by the way, could just say it was still worth it despite the chaos, right? I do think that a lot of people have not really dealt with the implications of what eating that crow means. But I can also tell you, Joe Biden has pissed off a lot of the establishment, particularly these people who want to intensify this war with Asia, and a lot of
I want to add something to that real quick.
Cold war with Asia, not active war with Asia. But yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, I keep telling people, I'm like, I think there's criticisms that can be made with regards to the exit strategy, right? But I still have to give Biden some level of credit. Like, I think I said to you before we started the show, like, it's like that scene in Glengarry Glen Ross, right? Brass balls. And I think Biden is showing some brass balls right now, to be honest. He's standing pretty firm. And, I was talking to people like Matthew Petty at Quincy about this. I don't think the establishment thought he was going to stand firm on this one. And he has thus far, which, it's kind of interesting watching this all happen, but in terms of the implications for, eating crow on this, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, the implications of eating crow on this is that, for one thing, a lot of the realists in the room are not so much concerned about Afghanistan. They're concerned about Taiwan. They're concerned about projecting power to China, because this is distasteful. I mean, the Chinese are mocking Biden over this, and rightfully so.
When you say the realists, who do you mean?
I mean, like the Declan Walshes of the world. I mean, like the liberal hawks, the people who are pushing.
No, I was just asking because, like, it's weird. Like, there's realists like, maybe like Anatole Levin, or I think even Stephen Walt and like John Mersheimer, that are like, well, we're sort of in the decline period and we have to get over it, and China's going to do what it's going to do. So there's different camps of realists as far as I can tell. But I know the type you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these people are still I mean, they probably actually still think that in regards to China too, actually. But they also think that regional projection of power is paramount, even though I don't think China has shown a whole lot of. It's definitely interested in being a world economic hegemon. Its military hegemony bets are a little bit more sketchy. I don't think there's none. I mean, the fact they have foreign military bases at all, even though it's like what 1/100th of what the U.S. has, because there's like, I think they have like 5.
For me, the bottom line with China is I don't think they want to do what America did. I don't think they want to be Team China World Police. Yeah.
But I also don't think, I think a lot of the left's reading of them sees them as like an ideological force, and that's from ideological reasons. And I just like to point out that the country that they have the most geopolitical tensions with after India, which may erupt into war, frankly, if China's GDP goes down, is actually Vietnam, which is a country that is a communist party that has liberalized on similar grounds, that is culturally very similar to China, and yet those geopolitical tensions there are tense enough that Vietnam asked the United States for help without imperial pressure. All right. So I do think that has to be accounted with trying to understand what is going on in the world right now without us projecting upon nation state shit that we don't understand ourselves, because it is convenient to our own internal narratives about our own fucking moral compasses, which I frankly don't care about.
So the last thing I wanted to say with the foreign policy stuff was, I mean, it's interesting. Like I said, I have a lot of faith, I think, in these institutions, which people are critical of, like these sort of think tanks that are starting to grow, right? That are more about a foreign policy of restraint. But even something like that, that's going to take probably a generation or two to really have much of a real impact. I mean, I was talking to Stephen Walt about this. I think we may see a change in how foreign policy is done from a new generation that may be more interested in restraint, but we're not there yet. I mean, we still have the old guard in this sort of machine.
As weird as it sounds, Mad Dog Mateus was actually a transitional figure, and he still isn't very good on this stuff, but he was way better than the neocons under Bush were.
Yeah.
And this also gets to how fucking insane the actual Trump response to this was, because I mean, you had ghouls like John Bolton being rehabilitated, while people who may have had
John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and anyone else. Michael Ledeen was buddy. Yeah.
And I'm not talking about Steve Bannon here, but you had a lot of people who came out of the paleoconservative business world who were not hawkish at all, who Trump purged. Partly because of their association with Bannon, partly for completely different reasons. Maybe they called Trump incompetent, et cetera and so forth. So it really doesn't matter how this goes about it. And a lot of people who, a lot of the people in the post left who were like, well, Trump did more to damage the American empire. Trump asked NATO to pay more of, the NATO nations other than the US to pay more of what was going on for their own security, which, by the way, Obama also did.
I think Trump set us back, 20 years. I mean,
it definitely set the liberal consciousness back, because liberal hawkishness came back.
So as much as I like groups like the John Quincy Adams Society or the Center for International Policy, people are very hesitant to listen to even those type of, I would say, like, they're very professional and sort of like, I think the reforms they want are very minimal in a lot of ways. It's not like they're calling for a complete revolution, right? But people are even afraid of that now after Trump, because they just saw it as the chaos presidency. So, in a way, I think Trump has re-emboldened the center, so to speak.
Well, I'm going to let you speak on this, because you and I have talked about this privately. But it's not just that the center could hold. Like, I was, everyone, like, I remember in 2016, people thought the center just can't hold. Oh, yeah, it held fine.
I mean, I don't think the center will hold forever, right? But when I say the center won't hold, I'm thinking like in terms of decades and generations.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas it's weird, because I'm finding that most people, when they say the center will not hold, they're thinking like they're acting like it's going to happen in like a year.
Well, they're collapsist, right? I mean, everyone just, there's something sexy about that. But it shouldn't be sexy. It should be horrifying. But
to get all cultural here for a bit, I love how you ever watch like the British apocalypse movies, like 28 Days Later, and then compare them to the American ones. And the American ones are always like we're going out with a bang, right?
Mhm.
But you watch something like 28 Days Later, and I guess there's that going out with a bang thing, but there's also a lot of imagery of like a slow, like just, oh, everything's being deserted and everything's just slowly collapsing in on itself throughout the films. And
right, which is the experience of their end of empire, right?
Right.
From
well, the
like
empire that we sort of inherited from them, right?
Right. Inherited, took, stole,
That is a weird thing, though. I feel like the best. It's funny you mentioned the the going out with a bang instead of the whimper sort of apocalyptic culture stuff is much more sexy to people, right? I always tell people that when it comes to something like 9/11, and I think there's legit questions to be asked about 9/11, especially now with the 9/11 victims' families civil lawsuit against Saudi Arabia. I think if you look into Saudi Arabia, and particularly the figure of Omar Abayoumi, who was sort of the point man for Al-Hazmi and Al-Midar, two of the hijackers when they landed in the U.S. before the attacks. He showed them all around L.A. and got them apartments. The FBI was saying he was, a Saudi intelligence agent, right? I think there's real questions to be asked about 9/11 and things like Saudi involvement, things like, why didn't the CIA and the Bin Laden unit share information about the Malaysia summit? But when you talk about this stuff with people who claim to know a lot about 9/11, they just sort of stare at you askance, like, what? What are you talking about? Who are these names? And I'm like, well, you should know about this. You're into the whole 9/11 issue. And they'll say, no. I want to talk about Larry Silverstein and Building 7. Because it's sexier. I mean, it is sexier to people to sort of, I think people like tabloids in this country.
I think it's even more than that. I mean, like the amount of people's politics it's actually eschatology that they don't even admit that's eschatology is kind of amazing to me. Like the revolution based on 1917 is going to happen any day now, but we have no idea how to bring it. We have no social network for it. We have nothing. And then, so what must happen is society must just collapse really fast. So, kind of like what happened in the Soviet Union, except daily life in the Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Union, didn't collapse, even though it was a mass die-off. All right. I mean, Dmitry Orlov, before he went pretty far right, was pretty good on spelling this out. Like, you could not know how bad things were collapsing through the shock doctrine, and yet things could be really fucking bad. I mean, you just look at like the population drops in some of Eastern Europe in the 90s. And what I find fascinating about that is you see precursors to that in a lot of the working class of the younger boomer, older Gen Xer generation, where you've just seen, below at and below median income lifespans just drop a year, drop another year, drop another year, drop another year, and yet the rich are like living to fucking 100. Because things like social safety nets and community have become a luxury good. And that's actually very similar to what happened, during the shock period of the USSR. It's for completely different reasons. But it's a similar trend. And what's funny, is during the end of the Obama administration, when this was beginning to be noticed, all right, this is leading up to Trump, and there's all these articles about the opioid epidemic and all that, and everyone immediately framed it as like, oh, you're just, and I say everyone, I do mean a lot of the left and liberals framed it as, oh, you're just doing concern trolling for white people. If they had actually paid attention to the stats, they would see that those stats spread across racial divisions not evenly, because a lot of the POC groups had shorter lifespans already, and so there was not a whole lot of change. But the reasons why it was happening, alcoholism, obesity, drug addiction, poor access to elder care, etc., were consistent in all groups. All right. Now that happened. It became a brief spat on fucking Facebook and Twitter and went away. But the conditions have not changed.
No, it's, I mean, I want to be as mad as you because, I mean, usually I am very fired up about all this because I don't know. I look at the whole political scene in the US, and first off, I'm not even sure how much politics anyone actually does anymore.
No,
I mean, it's kind of like
politics is actually cultural.
Even the responses to Afghanistan have been weird to me. Like just seeing people on the right sort of backtrack. They were, for the withdrawal. Now they're not for the withdrawal. It's just, like no one's coherent. And I don't know. I'm sort of tired with everyone because I look to the right of me and I'm like, oh, a ton of people on the right have just lost their minds and gone down QAnonville, right? They've gone to QAnon town, but
which, if you were going to evolve the alt-right to something that could like be integralist and include more people, was make it all vague and conspiratorial, but have an appeal to all kinds of lonely old people, regardless of their race. Yeah. Mostly it would be white people, but not all. In a way that like the alt-right absolutely couldn't do. And maybe Proud Boys can do little better, but
then I look at like I mean, I'm not even including the left in this equation because I really don't think I hate to say this, but I feel like we're not even part of the equation.
No, I mean six Congress people who are inconsistently loyal is so not.
What gets really me is I look at the liberal center, and to me, I think like the liberal center is completely against recognizing elite failure on any level whatsoever. I mean, I keep telling people, read the book, David Halberstam's book on Vietnam, The Best and the Brightest. The lessons from that have not been learned. Like there is no willingness to look at elite failure at all. And like that actually scares me the most about this moment we're in, because I mean, we should be looking at, well, why did everything turn out this way in Afghanistan? And I feel like that's not happening. I feel like it was the same with the opioid epidemic. I feel like there's elite failure when it comes to the vaccine stuff too. I listen to NPR and hear people lamenting about, well, why are Black communities not taking the vaccine? And I'm like, well, there's years of, well, I'm not trying to defend people not getting the vaccine, but there is a reason for this institutional mistrust, right? This distrust. And you know what? It started way before Trump. You could see it in the 90s. If you go back to the New York Times articles that were coming out in the 90s, there was a big fear over fusion paranoia, right? Farrow House was being attacked over that in the New York Times and the Post. Oliver Stone was being attacked for the JFK movie and all that stuff. Oh, you're undermining trust in the institutions. Well, the trust was already undermined, and it has built up to this point. And we've sort of just been coasting on not dealing with just the absolute lack of trust people have for our institutions.
The trust was undermined like by 1967.
Well, that's sort of what I was getting at. And it's never been dealt with by this sort of institutional failure.
They're happy with complaining about it, but they're not actually willing to do anything about it because, I mean, there's
that would mean they would have to be self-reflexive.
It would also mean they'd have to admit that there's limits to things you can do politically, which nobody really seems to want to do these days. They all want to believe, like the Adam Curtis dream, that we could build it another way, by will. We can build it another way. Another world is possible, but it is not possible of our own making just because we think it so.
Are you against magical thinking?
I mean, and that's, I mean, even in the left now, the revolutionary left, the pro-revolutionary left, whatever you want to call them, the social democratic left, the neo-Marxist left, the dirtbag left. What was the response to the Bernie scenario, which does indicate actually how much magical thinking was going on? It was grill pilling. It was, you lose something that, frankly, you never should have thought you were going to win. And you retreat into depoliticization. Because...
Yeah, it was interesting when the whole Bernie stuff went downhill. So you had... basically everyone dropped out except for Biden, right? Like they all consolidated around Biden. Everyone was very mad about that, right? But
it was literally the only reason Bernie was standing a chance, and people haven't looked at that.
But it shows that the Democratic Party has a real understanding of, I would say, political economy and what they needed to do. And like that's what you're up against in all is fair in love and war. I mean, what they did wasn't, it's not like what they did was illegal, right? Like they consolidated behind one candidate they thought could beat Bernie. So, and I feel like people haven't looked at that. I also think we have beautiful loser syndrome on the left.
We have beautiful loser syndrome in America. It's part of our fucking foundation.
That's actually a good point.
That's why we didn't notice we were building an empire the whole time, because we were like, oh, all those losers over there. We like, oh God. It's funny because the one thing I will say, in the Marxist debates right now, which are kind of removed from a lot of reality, today, I'll admit, on an emancipation Discord, I was between grading papers and had a mini meltdown because I was looking at all the stats on age and political affiliation and social attitudes and I realized that like the way Marxists talk about class consciousness is in class in itself and for itself. And, I think these are important concepts to grok, but the way it's actually been used is to just not deal with what people actually believe when we have reams of empirical evidence across cultures about how it actually works. All right. Working class people tend to be more empathetic. They tend to be given towards more racism when under stress. Racism, however, depletes faster for working class people when the stress is removed. The same tendencies towards racism are found in all classes when they feel economically competed against by specific racial groups. And this transfers to nationalities, religions, sexes, etc. All right? Totally true. Totally true. And it's not unique to white people either. I was reading the studies, and it was in multiple countries. It was not just the US where they were studying this. But what I found interesting is that racism goes away faster. Whereas if you invoke it with like upper middle class people, if they feel threatened, they maintain it longer. Pew poll after pew poll actually backs this up. Like the way racialization is viewed as an intense competition amongst like the middle and upper middle class. But also it makes sense why anti-racist signaling happens where there is no, where frankly, you can almost predict a lot of the rhetoric around race by how comfortable the area is.
You're almost talking like Robin DiAngelo now.
Why is that?
I didn't mean that in a bad way. Well, she's sort of alluding to some of what you're talking about with her. She just has a book called Nice Racism that just came out, where it's really about, racism amongst upper middle class and upper class white people.
Yeah, but the
progressives.
The thing is, and she's not wrong about that, but the thing is also like her answer to it is all about the fucking discourse.
Yeah.
Like they're like,
well, people... I mean, the thing with DiAngelo to me is like getting beyond all the theory. She's someone that gets hired to do lectures at companies, and then the companies can say, hey, we are trying to deal with racism and we want more diversity. Look, we hired Robin DiAngelo to speak for us. It's CYA for those companies in case something happens with a racist incident in their corporation or whatever. They can say, oh, well, look, we had Robin DiAngelo. You see what I mean? Like, she's sort of a hired gun, for CYA purposes.
I would actually even go so much to even say further than that. I mean, you say that Robin DiAngelo does this, but the implications of the research is not about social attitudes, like in the same way. It's about what people perceive as their material conditions. The research, however, also indicates that where these racial divisions exist, all right, wages drop for all parties. This is historically true. The average black worker in the Northeast in the 40s made more money than the white Southern worker did objectively. Because you could always use the racial tensions to break a strike, and it would be in everyone's interest to do so. There was a reason why Carnegie, when he broke the mining strikes and basically made the Cornish and Welsh white, by the way, because they weren't identifying with WASP before that, was able to do that by bringing in an all African American labor force. All right, this is something that it's like both transparently obvious, but no one wants to deal with because they don't want to believe unfortunate things about people that they wish to be their moral agent. All right, and I say that because the other thing about the working class thing is poor people, the lower you are in the socioeconomic scale, the less likely you are to think that class is actually an inhibitor in your life, weirdly. And people go, well, that's a lack of class consciousness. Well, yeah, that may be so. It is kind of a lack of objective analysis in your life. That's not also, everyone says that's the United States. It's not the United States. It's a trend you see across the planet. There's also a sense though that like the authoritarianism from stress and stress responses is something that you see more in oppressed and overly worked people. All right. We can't allow for someone to be both more compassionate and legitimately wronged and have some of the traits that we're fighting against. It's like we can't even fucking comprehend it. And it's very hard to get working class people to care about, I don't know, a foreign war unless they know people who are getting killed in it, which in the height of the aughts, they did. All right.
Right.
Now,
right.
One of the things I pointed out about, the mythologies around like the Boober anti-war movement is Vietnam ends in 1975, right? When does Grenada start? When does our crypto wars in Latin America start?
Go on.
1983.
Yeah, I was going to say it starts with Reagan, right?
Yeah. It took less than half a decade for them to completely retool the army, get rid of all the draft, which also stopped the social solidarity base for any kind of mass movement against war. It just made it kind of a neutral background thing, which people didn't even have to know was going on. It took them what, a third of a decade to be able to enact that. Like, I don't think people grok what that means. All right. And what happened? Why was it ignored? Why didn't no one notice? Why was caring about stuff like, I don't know, the Sandinistas, however you feel about Daniel Ortega, which, by the way, a lot of the romanticism about that ignores that, the Sandinistas were just as much of a neoliberalizing force as any right-wing force was, because they were forced to in the market. It wasn't political will. The people who cared about that were largely affluent and in urban areas with large social safety nets. Even though a lot of those areas are nowhere near as affluent and with nowhere near the social safety nets they have even privately now. You look at New York, all right? If you're in New York, you have a lot more access to a lot of stuff, even if it's crumbling, like it's there. That's also true in like most of California. There is infrastructural wealth there from the hoarding of massive amounts of wealth in general. It has downstream effects. It's not trickle-down economics, but it is rich people want their fucking infrastructure to work. And so it has a very different dynamic on the way the left seems to interact. It is not, for example, that the DSA is not working class. The DSA is disproportionately working class, although slightly richer, slightly, than the generic population of working class people in the United States. All right. But they're also in these areas. No one likes to look at what that implies. And no one likes to look at the objective sociology of class. And when you put some leftists to do this, they literally start talking about how class isn't a social economic phenomenon, it's a political one, or consciousness is some kind of religious bullshit.
I was gonna mention, like, it's like when you try to talk, there's a lot of people on the left that get very uncomfortable if I start talking about Pierre Bourdieu's whole Homo academicus thing, because he's actually very critical of academia. I mean, it is an institution that is used to reproduce class structures.
It is the primarily reproduction of, like class.
But that's his point. And there are a lot of leftists that are college educated that don't like talking about that, or that are involved in academia that's a no-go zone.
The innovation that Pierre Bourdieu brings in is the experience of class is actually different than your objective means of production. Your relation to the means of production of Marxism. And it's actually something that early Marx, in his theory of alienation, kind of begins to tap out. Like, he has the 4 types of alienation. One includes worker from worker because of ethnic, sectarian, and sectional competition. He doesn't actually include racial that much because ethnic would have covered it for him. And at the time, national was a word for both. And it actually didn't have that much relationship to the state in Europe. It was a like ethnic group term. So national competition was part of that. Marx is aware of it. Bourdieu works it out. All right. The habitus, the habits, the self-reinforcing cultures. You talk about, like, for example, you and I talked about this once. And about social capital and its relationship to actual capital. If you come from a blue-collar working class background and your family is from the poorer parts of the working class, when you don't have money, what do? Can you go home to your parents?
Right.
Maybe you can, but you're not going to have your own room. You're not going to have...
It's not the same as for someone that can go home to their parents and their
for live in their parents' basement for years.
Yeah.
Even though they're the same level of poor, they're part of the same class. Their experience of that is radically different.
Right.
And that actually is a division factor within the working class itself. This is why I resent all this PMC talk, because it obscures this. But it's still true.
Right.
All right? So it's easier for the upper parts of the working class to talk about class. Why?
Go on.
I mean, just think about what it implies, right? If you have to admit that by being on the lower stratas of the working class, that you have less access to education, that even if you're very smart, you objectively have to do triple the work to get ahead. What does that do to your self-conception?
Right. All right? I've always taken it as I feel like I will catch heat for this, but I feel like the people that talk about the PMC thesis are people that mad that they're not where the other PMCs are at, if that makes sense. Uh, I think it's sort of a resentment thing, like an internecine class thing between people within the upper, middle, and upper classes.
I would say middle upper class is a little. There's been a Marxist term to say there's no such thing as the middle class, and in a sense, that's kind of true, because the middle class, in Europe, and even if you talk to people in the UK today, they mean the bourgeois, right? The upper class is actually the aristocrats that barely exist anymore,
right?
And there's blurring there, and that's kind of changed, but it kind of still has it. In the United States, we did have a bourgeois aristocracy until probably the 1930s. And their literal DNA is still on our political elites. It is not on our business elites anymore. But like even Barack Obama comes from the same cluster of families as George Bush on the white side of his family.
Right.
You know, and you know, that's something like racist conspiracy people will pick up on and make Bilderberger stuff. But that's
right.
Really
you have the David Icke thing about like, oh, they're all related to Charlemagne.
Right. But that's really about like how a bourgeois project is established and who has got literal kinship ties to the initial instantiations of the revolutions, you know, the bourgeois revolutions.
I guess what I was getting at though is like, I mean, I think there are people in that are lower on the class rung that don't even think about class because it's almost like an amor fati thing, you know, like yeah. Whereas I think a lot of the people that talk about PMC and a lot of these people that are post-left, I think are the people that are just really, really angry that they didn't get what they think they were promised. As in, oh, I was supposed to have the nice cushy professional job and the, 2.5 kids in the house, and I didn't get that.
And they were sold that. I mean,
I'm not saying they're bad people or anything for being resentful about that. I probably have a little bit of that resentment too. But
I have it.
I think what's at work.
And I'm from the blue collar working class because I was sold that was my way to ensure my legacy, my family's legacy, my brothers and their kids. If we did this, that they would be okay. And what did we get? A fuck ton of debt.
Right.
That if you subtract the debt from the assets, we're actually doing worse off than our parents were from the same social class, even though it might look on immediate income brackets that we're doing better. But that's that's the difference in comparing wealth and comparing income, because wealth has a generational multiplier effect. It actually is part of like structural racism. Well, that's not just racial. It's more, I mean, it definitely in America is racialized like to a core that's almost hard to understand. But when you look at stuff like what is the rational core of something like the ADOS movement, right? Which I'm not endorsing, but they have a point that most of the national Black leadership has been either mixed race and immigrant or immigrant. And they did not have the same generational wealth limitations.
Well, they're also not completely wrong about, how do I put this? I think there is internecine conflict in the Black community. It's actually not new either.
No, it's not new at all.
I mean, ADOS types
white guys talking about it, but I've seen it for years.
But ADOS types will talk about like the Blaze Society, right? Which is like there are like sort of like Black community equivalents to things like Skull and Bones. You know, these sort of and I'm not getting into conspiracy theory when I talk about that.
No,
I think these are just
it's the cultural institutions of the Black bourgeoisie and the Black middle class.
But
which is a thing. So
what's so interesting to me about ADOS is that I've met immigrants from places like Nigeria that will be like, well, I'm not one of those, African Americans. Don't like they don't want to be associated with the the African descendants of slavery, like American descendants of slavery. And there is like this internecine conflict there that's very real. And that is the sort of rational kernel when it comes to ADOS. And I've become more critical of ADOS as time goes on. I think they have a pretty strong moral argument, to be honest. But there's, I mean, it's really off-putting. I mean, it's very blood and soil.
They have the moral argument comes directly with the wall of what the implications would be.
Yeah.
You want a racialized tax system for reparations, which shuts out even most non-white people and a good portion of Black people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm just saying on the surface, like that, it makes sense. Like, oh, the people that are actual descendants of slavery should be the ones that get the reparations. Like, I get that as the moral argument.
The other thing about it is like, it creates all these other tensions with other oppressed groups, some of which who are frankly more oppressed, like indigenous people in the United States, and in Canada, frankly. But the other thing that people don't want to look at there even is like, we talk about stress being a conservatizing force. Outside of the Dene Nation and bracketing out Hawaiians from the category of indigenous, how do most of the people on the res vote? If they vote, which is a big fucking if. I mean, like, why, if I was them, I wouldn't vote either, but like,
right.
It tends to be very conservative.
Right. You mean with indigenous people?
Yeah, with indigenous people on the res specifically.
Okay. I was always going to say, it always fascinated me how like Russell Means, of Native American Indian movement fame, he went like really libertarian at the end.
Yeah.
I think there's more of that than people realize.
The other thing I would say is one of the other kernels of ADOS is actually a weird. It's actually a result of American immigration policy, with the example of certain groups that have been given temporary refugee status, like Somalis. The cost of an African immigrant coming to the United States is like 20 times higher than the cost of a Mexican immigrant coming to the United States, which is itself like 20 times higher than if you're coming from like Korea, South Korea. All right. Which means that, for example, Nigerians who come to the U.S., which are a demographic that, depending on which survey you look what day, is equal to either South Asians or are themselves as the richest singular demographic group in the country. But that makes perfect sense when you look at how high the bar is for them to immigrate. All right. But this causes all kinds of tensions in the Black community. And it's not new. Harry Cruz was writing about this with Caribbeans, Caribbeans, non-Haitians specifically. Caribbean non-Haitians, that not Caribbeans, not Haitians aren't Caribbeans, but in the 1950s and 60s, as, in his turn towards, Black cultural nationalism. All right. When he gave up on the CPUSA, and basically thought that to make a collective subject that was coherent, they would have to build a cultural subject in the Black community, and that it was going to have to be careful about its relationship to Caribbean immigrants to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It has in it the core of ADOS before anyone was talking anything like that.
Yeah.
But it does come blood and soil very quickly. I mean, and we should not be surprised by that.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't fit our narratives about moralities and oppressed people.
Right.
All the rhetoric of aggrievement in like Germany, for example, which goes back to like the way they quoted Tacitus. It was true that until like the 1850s, that Germans were shut out of a lot of the benefits of French and English Europe. They also, even compared to the Mediterranean countries, with the exception of Greece, which had its own issue with the Ottomans, did not participate because of that nearly to the level of the other Western powers, because they weren't consolidated to do it in the great imperial colonial rush. And while that was part of why, say, for example, the Marxist of the SPD thought that they were the prime country for the revolution, because they didn't have the same imperial, ill-gotten gains to prop things up the way that the older capitalist powers did, and yet they were still part of the core. It was also that resentment that was used as the prime rhetoric of the fascist movement, particularly when appealing to a downwardly mobile petty bourgeois before proletarianization had gone over 35%.
I was just going to add to the, since we were talking about ADOS, and God, two white guys talking about ADOS.
Yeah,
God,
it's real bad. Like,
but,
it's real bad, but it's...
No, I mean, it's fascinating to me, and I kind of find... I find ADOS interesting because I wonder what it can tell us about, like, in a lot of ways, I feel like it's almost a form of blowback against this sort of Farrakhan-esque sort of Pan-Africanism.
Yeah.
And I mean, I relate a lot of things back to, like,
I think it's also a blowback against Obama. Like,
yes. Yeah.
Like, and it's like the whole idea that would occasionally come up, and even in the Boondocks, which is not ADOS adjacent at all, but like the first black president wasn't really black. Which when you say it feels incredibly racist.
I'm having flashbacks to that episode of the Boondocks where Obama became president and they all get basically screwed while Huey is giving interviews to Werner Herzog saying this is the end of America.
Yeah.
It's weird how much that show still stands up, by the way. I still watch it. I'm like, wow, things have not completely changed.
Well, it's interesting, actually, if you watch the Boondocks and talk about the years of the discourse, because this gets into the discourse time period, right? Boondocks starts at the end of the Bush administration. You had clear, direct proxies to...
well, Magruder got slammed a lot, too, by, like, a lot of these same war on terror, like, the Hawks and whatnot.
Right.
Yeah.
But he also got slammed by black nationalists. So, like, which we forget, even though he was the most sympathetic voice that anyone had seen in, like, popular media.
Well, the weird thing about
comic strip nationally syndicated in the late 90s.
What's so weird about the show that was on Adult Swim at Cartoon Network was I always found the Boondocks fascinating because, like, every character has their, like, flaws in it, but none of them are, like, truly completely, like, evil. Even Uncle Ruckus. I mean, he will help out Huey's grandpa and whatnot. I mean, each character has their flaws. Like, there's the
even the Dick Cheney proxy isn't totally evil. He's just mostly evil.
Well, even Huey, like, people think Huey is, like, the like hero of the show and whatnot. But I mean, the way he treats, I forget the biracial girl, Jasmine.
Jasmine. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he treats her like crap at times, even though she's the only one that sort of befriends him. Every character in that has their... Well, she has her flaws too, right? Like, they both have flaws. All of these characters have flaws, but they're also, like, wholly human in a way that I don't see in a lot of media today.
Well, I mean, I was also thinking about how, like, the Boondocks had to be edited to be shown now.
Yes, yeah. Well, they've taken whole episodes off of HBO now. You can only get... I mean, they did the one Johnny Rebel inspired episode, which, if people know who Johnny Rebel is, God. But, like, you can still get those episodes, I think, on iTunes. But it is interesting. Like, a lot of those episodes you can't get anymore on HBO, at least.
Yeah. Obama was the second black president.
Yeah, I remember people used to say Bill Clinton was the first black president. Do you remember those days?
Yes, I do. Arsenio Hall said it, actually.
Right? My God.
There's weird times. but the discourse, right? You and I were going to talk about the discourse, and I guess we have been. What we've seen is all these movements that all have a rational core to them. There is a real rational core to ADOS. There's a real rational core to anti-revisionist internet Stalinism. I mean, there kind of is.
Well, I mean, we've had this discussion about even, I mentioned like Farrakhan and Pan-Africanism, Nation of Islam type stuff. I mean, I even we talked about the episode I did on the Nation of Islam. I think there's reasons the Nation of Islam has its own sort of theology, and I can understand why it arises. I mean, there's I don't know. I know you use the term rational core, but there's just, you can take things from all of these different, disparate groups and find something in them that is like, oh, I get why they see things this way.
Yeah, you can. I mean, one of the things I think you have to understand about, like, for example, the Nation of Islam's like weird Yaqub stuff is it is kind of a theodicy. It does explain the problem of black pain. It does it in conspiratorial terms. I also think, I mean, I don't want to say there's a rational core to QAnon, but Jeffrey Epstein existed.
I always tell people, see, it's weird because I always go back to this line of like, well, QAnon wouldn't exist if people. I always go back to that whole like, well, we just don't trust our institutions. So of course QAnon happens. Like, it's. I always want to blame the sort of institutions for their own failings. Like, why do these things arise? I mean, I think it's because of failings made by the institutions that are supposed to be all powerful and almighty, but they aren't. They make mistakes and they make catastrophes at times. See Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, but for all these things that have rational cores of truth in them, that overall, a lot of their effects are profoundly negative.
Yes.
Even if they're right about something,
right.
Like you and I talk about, the tanky problem. I don't even like the term. I don't like to use the term tanky because I think it's fucking meaningless now. Like, people forget that it was actually, it even split some ML groups in the 1950s. And there were trots on the ML side. In fact, now they are the Stalinist groups, which is kind of hilarious. But
I'm very wary of that term tanky and how it's used a lot now by people, because like that term
I've been called a tanky, which is
well, it's weird because I feel like anyone who questions the sort of foreign policy consensus is now just called a tanky. So,
at the same time, we have seen the way a lot of people who won't even like own up to being anti-revisionist or Stalinist or anything like that, do get really shilly on certain regimes in ways that just kind of deny that anyone other than the United States is ever guilty of atrocity ever. When clearly a lot of the times all the sides involved are.
I think it was John Dolan, aka the great Gary Brecher, that said every country has their atrocity story. And I always found that quote very interesting. I think it's true. I think you can look at any given nation state and you will find horror upon horror, piled upon horror.
I mean, it's one of the things that Jean Bajelon and I often say about, what's going on in Asia and all the, with certain minority Muslim groups, not just in China, by the way. I mean, not even remotely just in China. It's part of the national consolidation project. It's not different than the consolidation of almost any nation, including Turkey, including Greece, including the US, including the UK. It's just the U.S. was on such a scale that it's like undeniably mass genocide. And these other places, it's not mass. It may not be genocide in the way we mean it. It's definitely not like the way that it's used against the Roma, and the Jews or whatever in the 1930s and 40s. But it is an attempt to, if you don't assimilate, we're going to drop your birth rate to zero. Like, we're not going to kill you, but we're going to do everything we can to lower your birth rate. That is what it is. It's ugly. There's usually historically speaking, there's usually massacres involved. But we seem that there's too much media for that to be easily done now. It still happens, but it's a lot rarer. But that's part of what national consolidation means. All right. That was true in Europe too. Like minorities got screwed. And if you really look at a lot of the more recent states, like the consolidation of Spain or consolidation of Italy, those still resonate in those countries today. All right. In ways that a lot of people outside of of not even Europe, but like those countries specifically, barely can articulate. It's even true for like the consolidation of the UK, which has never really been done. It's only really been done in England. In some ways, not even fully there. So it's and that process in England was over the course of like 1,000 years. All right, but it was bloody. And the consolidation of a lot of Latin American countries, which have led to genocides against indigenous people, were national projects. Some of it's colonial, but not all of it. And
It's weird because I feel like a big portion of this conversation is just about. I think all these different political movements miss, and I think this is true on the left, unfortunately. I think sometimes we miss the forest for the trees, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What do you mean? I mean, I think
I feel like we get caught up in single stories for like 1 week and then we move on to the next thing. We don't view it in terms of the broader picture. I mean, we had the assassination of the leader of Haiti recently. I mean, that seemed to involve private mercenary firms. I mean, this relates back to the War on Terror, right? And the Blackwater days. And, we look at the scandal that hit with Pegasus spyware software from NSO Group, and no one's talking about that anymore, which to me, that's one of the biggest issues we're facing. We're now seeing the sort of quasi-democratization of surveillance society stuff. And it's very, very dangerous. And I think we sort of let a genie out of the bottle with the War on Terror, but no one, and maybe I'm prone to doing this because I grew up at the beginning of the War on Terror, but I feel like people don't connect things back to the past 20 years and even further in a lot of cases. Like you can connect, we were talking about Reagan earlier, right? We can connect things back to Reagan. There's a whole bigger picture, and all of this history is really connected, and I don't think we have the attention span for it anymore to sort of connect the dots. Maybe it's not attention spans. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just that politics has become a spectator sport for, neats, but
yeah, I mean, yeah, that's also that too. That sounds like one of the things that we have to look at is the fact that, the politics as a spectator sport and this politics as a commentary, even the radical politics, it affects so very little.
Right.
It has so little effect. I mean, you can go into Twitter and you can basically enter a fever dream for a few hours and feel like you're participating in this vibrant intellectual discourse with extremists. And yet it doesn't have a lot of, I mean, frankly, QAnon has more effect in the real world. It doesn't have that much effect.
Well, that's the thing, though. It's hard to tell where we're at because of all this, right? I think social media distorts our perception of things. And so I know you hate Gramsci, right? But I keep thinking
I did a video that was explaining Gramsci today. So it was sympathetic. But yes, I do hate Gramsci.
Okay. So I keep thinking of this quote, and maybe this is evidence that I get pulled into the sort of apocalypticism of American culture too much too. But there's this quote by him that I was talking about with a friend. The new world is yet to be born, and the old world is dying. And now is the time of monsters, the interregnum. That's something along those lines. And I tend to believe that we're in a transition period, but that could all be illusory too. That could all just be sort of getting caught up in this fever dream, as you put it, of social media or, even podcasting or any of these things. Like you get caught up in the spectacle of it. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you think we are in sort of an interregnum period?
Yeah, I think we're. I mean, honestly, I think this is almost like a massive social cope. Because we've always believed in democracy and social power and all that, and in some ways, it's becoming apparently clear that democracy is a social sham. At least in the way that it's always been instantiated in the capitalist West.
The iron law of oligarchy.
Right. Well, even that's kind of a sham because that makes it sound like there is no way out. I mean, that's Pareto's point. I mean, that's why they became fascist. They did. Historically. Robert Michel is the person who quoted that law. He went from anarchist to national syndicalist to fascist. Just, pointing that out. The iron law of anarchy was used to justify capitulation.
So in that regard, I mean, I don't want to use the old line of like, may you live in interesting times, but it often feels like we're living in interesting times. But as you said, on the other hand, to be like the academic, like, oh, but then on the other hand, you're right. I think we get caught up in this fever dream that, oh, things are going to change, and the Bernie-lution and what I don't know what the next iteration of it will be, but
I think things can change, but you have to realize what your limitations are to start to change them. Like, I'm not a fatalist. I wouldn't do this if I was. And there are days, I'm not going to lie, where I get up in the morning and I think I have another fucking podcast to do. I'm going to have to talk to these people and they're going to be like, all whatever new thing is they think is going to fix the world. And they're going to talk about it amongst themselves for about 5 hours and they're not going to do shit. And I'm not going to do shit, even though I'm trying, by educating people, by being a member of the union, by doing what I can, by helping in mutual aid, by doing, by working myself to fucking death. Which, why should I do that? What good is it for me to do that? All right. So that tension, but if I totally believed it didn't matter, why would I do it at all? The optimism comes from the realization of where you're
I don't know. I
at.
tell people that I'm bearing witness to history. That's all I tell people anymore, but go on.
I mean, Colin did say that
Colin
Marxism
Drummond?
is no, but Comrade Payne is Marxism is a Christian heresy. You got to take a leap of faith, believe in any of that shit. But Marx is actually very clear that humans make their own history, but not of their own choosing. We don't pick the conditions in which we live.
Yeah.
And if we don't see those conditions for what they actually are, even when we have a radical ideology against the current, we're not like that. Actually, can be part of the current social system, and it is. It objectively is.
So, what I wanted to go back to something before we close out. I don't know how long you go with these, but I know we're coming up against 2 hours.
I usually cut it at 2 hours.
So what I wanted to get into with you was, you said that you think at the beginning you don't think the anti-war movement or the coalitions that we've seen between, like I said, I'm very excited about what Quincy is doing with, conservatives, progressives, leftists, and libertarians sort of all coming together on these issues. And I know we've talked before about like, well, we're going to have to work with libertarians on some issues and conservatives on some issues. But you sound like maybe you're backtracking on that a little bit in the sense that you said, well, what do these coalitions really accomplish?
Well, if people have political power, then yes, you'd have to work in coalitions. The other thing I would say, though, is
we don't even have political power, though.
Right, right. And frankly, neither do the conservatives. I mean, we're talking about either. Even like the Institute for Responsible Government People and stuff like that. They've been in the military. They've been proxies to power. No one calls them on the phone to take foreign policy advice.
Right.
In some ways, by being honest, they've actually given up part of their ability to influence power.
Well, at least for the current moment. I mean, I don't know how these things are going to influence. I often wonder how there's that traditionalist Catholic magazine. I think it's called New Mind. I wonder how things like that, or Quincy, or even left-wing organizations, I wonder how these things are going to affect younger generations. It's almost like I think a lot of people play the long game. But
yeah, I think that's
I wonder what the effect of these things will be going,
well,
10,
I mean,
10 years, 20 years down the line.
we always talk about the strategy of patience, right?
Right.
But the problem with the strategy of patience right now is we have no idea what time frame we actually have left.
Right.
Like, we might have another 1,000 years of crumbling bullshit, I mean,
right.
And we might not. All right. One of the things anthropologically that makes this so hard to talk about is societies in the past were they might have been regionally integrated, and when they fell apart, it felt apocalyptic, but plenty of people actually survived it, et cetera, and so forth. I mean, you look at like the Mayans didn't go away. There's plenty of them. You can still meet Mayans. You can go down to Guatemala now. But that culture had a near apocalyptic break, right? And in some ways, everyone's going through, like, somebody's going through an apocalypse all the time.
Right.
The difference about right now is global capital is world integrated and highly centralized across national boundaries.
Which is different than before, which has implications for the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and a lot of other things.
Right. It has implications for all these kinds of things. Things that Marxists want to deny now. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the most popular Marxist trend right now is to say the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is not true because it's not justified in value terms, and Marx didn't argue for it, or that it doesn't mean anything. And I actually do sort of get the argument made by people like Cordelia at Real Abstractions that it doesn't necessarily lead to anything positive in and of itself, right? But I think statistically, with real commodities, it's something that I now see more and more mainstream economists accept, and I now see more Marxists arguing against it, which is bizarre. All right? I mean, I see more conservatives talking about secular stagnation in nearly Marxist terms than I see some Marxists. Because if we really believe in the declining rates of profits, and we really believe the welfare state was based on those profits, we really do have to look and go, some of the reforms we want and we need, they might even be more efficient in the short run. But in the long run, they might be doomed. And that means we can't stop there. But what does it mean to do? I mean, you're facing like, I was also talking today, and this is going to be the last point. We're facing states that outside of China have less and less popular legitimacy. They have less and less social capacity. Like, they can't really convince people to do what they want them to do, particularly in the United States. All right.
Yeah, but I would say you see a lot of the. I would say you see a lot of the same phenomena everywhere. That's what's so interesting to me. Like when I have guests from Russia on, I think in the U.S. you have people that are like, the Kremlin is responsible for everything. But I know people in Russia who will tell me, yeah, that's the line here is the CIA is responsible for everything.
Well, I mean, yeah, you hear it all the time. Like everyone's
there's a discontent globally, I think, in a lot of ways.
Right.
Is what I'm saying.
Well, the weird exception is China, and there's still discontent there. There is discontent there. It's mostly workerish, but it's not so far aimed at the government. Or let me rephrase that. It's not aimed at the national government. It actually is aimed a lot at the local government. You have local outrage that, manifest. And so there's that. But there's also a cynicism even in China about the state. Like when I talk to Chinese people who are not upper middle class expatriates, they don't have this, like, it's weird. The upper middle class expatriates from China seem to actually believe CCP lines in a way that, like, when I talk to people like everyday people when I was in China who spoke English, and a lot of Chinese workers do, they didn't. They were much more cynical, but they did sort of. They had more faith in their government than we did. When I say than we have in ours right now. But it does seem like more and more universal, right? Like this is not a U.S. only phenomenon. It's not a Western Europe only phenomenon. It's not a West only phenomenon. It seems the most advanced as a form of social pathology in the core. But we also have to admit that like China's part of the core now. Like it really is. Like
well, that's why I brought up that Gramsci quote of the new world is waiting to be born, the old world is dying, we live in a time of monsters, because I think it really encapsulates. I think we live in a time of great risk. Where we'll see I think we're going to see a lot of really weird coalitions. I think we're going to see a lot of risks being taken by all sides of the sort of political game, the chessboard. And I think things are going to be very strange going forward. That's why it's almost hard to make predictions about anything.
The analogy for where we live right now is not World War II. It's not the Cold War, despite all the pivoting towards China. It's the lead up between the end of the Long Depression and World War I.
Yeah.
That's where we're at. That was the last great time of monsters.
Right.
The great movements of the peoples, the carving up the world into nation states that people didn't even fucking want.
Right.
The change of the entire world government from elites who are aristocratic to popular legitimacy, but some of those same elites are still ruling things.
Right.
But they literally can't do so with any legitimacy the way they used to.
Right.
All right. Yes, we live in that time. But the thing is right now, in a way that was not totally true in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, like in 1917, we did not know that we had the destructive capacity, not just with nukes, which we have, but also just as byproducts and feedback loops of our own seemingly benign technology.
Mm-hmm.
We have put more carbon in the atmosphere since 1960 than all time periods prior, including the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
This is not, the stakes are higher for a lot of ways, and they're high in a way that, like, as an individual,
as you said too, I mean, we're living in globalistan now, right? Like, and that really changes the dynamic and the stakes of the game. This is an interlocked system now, so everything's at stake.
And yet, things like cooperation between whatever governments in the U.S. and whatever governments in China is necessary for, like, world ecological I hesitate to say collapse, but very, very badness.
Right.
Because sometimes I think the collapse narrative is to get us out, like, right? Like they make it, they're actually kind of an easy doomer escape pod, which is the other thing I don't want people, like, when I have a lot of.
Do you think there's a difference between? I always tell people do you think there's a difference between collapse narratives and maybe decline narratives? Because I think you can get through a decline, right? But I don't see many people talk about declines. Everyone's all about that quick out with a bang collapse at the end of the day.
Because the out with the bang collapse has this seeming like infinite possibilities in which it opened us all at once.
Right.
And yes, things can collapse overnight. I mean, like, whole world orders have collapsed in like a course of a year, when I say world orders,
do you think people really even consider what that would mean? Collapse, though?
No, I don't.
I feel like everyone's a LARPer with it. Like, okay.
Well, I mean, they always think like, oh, it's going to force our people in to do the things that they need to do. And I'm like, the people with the wealth are the most likely people to survive that. Just statistically speaking, they have the wealth and they have the guns and they have the Thompson gun and you have none. Except the Thompson guns are drones. So, I mean, that scenario has always been like, you guys are just too optimistic. The bad guys win or we all die. Like,
That's almost why I tell people like I'm just in favor of like buying time at this point and keeping things stable enough where maybe we can, grow as a movement on the left. But I don't think we're winning a protracted people's war is what I always tell people.
We're not waging a protracted people. Don't think that I'm telling you to start either. God, when people are like, we just got to go overthrow the government, I'm like, yeah, you're just going to get mowed down. Like, oh, they wouldn't mow us all down. Why? It would be existential for them. It would truly be existential for them. At that point, if it's die or not rule anymore, it's not as I get to leave and go sulk in my head and enjoy my decline and no empire anymore and I got to go home. I'm still alive.
Well, also there's the human cost thing. Like you've talked about this before. Like revolution is not like a pretty picture, right? Like I don't think people think about like. I think you've brought up examples before of okay, so a revolution is happening, and you may like little Mrs. Blankenship or whatever down the street, but if she's seen as an informant, what are you going to do about that? Like you know.
Well, yeah. I mean, you might like little Mrs. Blankenship down the street, and she's not even deliberately a informant, but she got captured. And if the state, which has all the drones, is going to come after you, what do you have to do about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of like sticky moral conundrums that come up when it comes to revolution, which is part of the reason why I feel like people don't actually take the idea of revolution seriously. Well, they just throw it around. It's like a slogan.
It's one of the things, and I don't want to go into like therapy culture, but let's talk about trauma for a minute. Like real trauma, right? I've always said that one of the things about good old comrade Uncle Joe, that I take very seriously is I believe he believed almost everything he said. Really, I really do. And I think his paranoia, even against the old Bolsheviks, which was extreme, was born out in the fact that his survival against, the Tsarist government, particularly in Georgia, which was a particularly violent frontier of that, because it was a settler colonial area, effectively for the Russian Empire. What made his paranoia justifiable? But when you actually run a political organization, or I don't know, a world superpower that way, what happens? You have no leadership. You killed it all, and you've destroyed a lot of your social base because you've either killed them or you've let them kill each other. I mean, it is ironic, for example, that like I see people who defend like current China also defend things that Mao did that like the CPC doesn't defend. They'll defend they'll say that there's no like class struggle going on in China when the Chinese media allows it to be talked about.
One thing I want to go back to, since you said, and maybe like listeners would find that shocking. You said, I think Stalin believed in, these things he believed in. I always have this argument with, and I think it's a problem with everyone adopting a very conspiratorial mindset today. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's true of left and right and liberal and everyone else.
Everybody's become a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, but right? the thing is, like, that gets back to Bourdieu and Bourdieu's idea of the illusio. You have to sort of believe in the game in order to play it, right?
Right.
If there's one thing I've learned from the podcasts I do, and just talking to various people in DC, and Chicago and other places where there's, different people that would know better than some kid from Pennsylvania, right? But I think people don't understand, like, so someone like Robert Kagan, one of the arch neocons, like, he believes in what he says. Like, it's not some cynical thing. Like he believes in this like liberal international order, and we're always the good guy. The empire is good, and et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think people can believe that. I think people have a really hard time believing that, like, it's not. I mean, weapons contractors in the defense industry plays like a role in foreign policy, but there is an ideology behind all this stuff. And a lot of the reason we have a foreign policy blob is simply because all these people go to the same institutions. They go to the Hudson Institute, or they go to the same Ivy League schools, and they believe in all of this. They're brought up to believe in it.
They swallowed their own Kool-Aid. All right? That's actually a dangerous thing. Like it's Danny Bessner talks about the fact that Truman probably didn't believe his own Kool-Aid. Eisenhower definitely didn't believe his own Kool-Aid. All right, definitely. JFK weirdly really believed in the importance of anti-communist optics. Truly did. Everything we read, and it's well documented, he believed that shit more than Eisenhower did.
One of the interviews that has always stuck with me is I interviewed Douglas Valentine about his book, The Phoenix Program, which, if people don't know, the Phoenix Program was basically like a giant terror campaign taken up by elements of the CIA in the Vietnam War, right? But what he said to me is he interviewed all the people involved with it. And I would say the Phoenix Program is his best book. I don't agree with all the other books necessarily that he's written or aspects of them, but the Phoenix Program is a really good book. And he interviewed the people that were directly involved with it. And one thing he said to me was, all these people believed in it. Like he said to me that these are the type of people that would have gone into a burning house to get their child. And of course, he doesn't like these people ideologically, but what he was trying to say was, these are the people that would give you the shirt off their back, all this other stuff. And yet they did this campaign of terror in Vietnam. And he's like, they did it because they believed. They believed that they were doing what was necessary for their countrymen and all this stuff. And sometimes I think people don't realize that, like, people really do drink the Kool-Aid. Ideology is a hell of a drug. I will put it that way. And I think even the people that we consider our enemies, that are our enemies politically, I think they buy their own stuff. They buy their own supply.
And, we sure as fuck do.
Yeah, and I think people should take that more seriously than just assuming everything is cynical.
I mean, this is. I mean, maybe if people actually grasped, like, I don't believe in Althusserian ideology, but there's one rational core to it that it's kind of interpolated on you, but you actually have to kind of believe it for it to work, right? Ideology, alienation, and fetishism, they all operate partly because the cost of not believing it is like social collapse. We don't have money anymore. Or, if we don't believe that even something like gold has commodity value, it doesn't. All right. But
you have to buy into the illusio.
Right. You have to. Not even because you want to, but because, like, the entire edifice of your life is kind of dependent on that shared, agreed social
reality, the consensus reality,
consensus reality functioning, an intersubjective consensus reality. And a lot of people who rebel against it do so in crazy paranoid land.
Can I comment on something real quick? Since
Go ahead.
We have a comment about, I guess, Eisenhower as one of the good guys. I don't know if that's ironic or not, but I mean, Eisenhower also gave us Operation Ajax. So, I mean, he may have warned us about the military-industrial complex.
He also built it.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, though. Yeah. I mean, and he was, I think there's a really good book called Soldiers of Reason by Alex Abella. I think he was talking very specifically about the Rand Corporation in some ways. And I think we're like way past even that point now. I mean, things have evolved on a level that is, we're not in the 1950s anymore.
No, but I mean, it's funny because, like, the people seem to think that things start true believing it in cynically, and I think it's the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
I think they start cynically and in true believing.
Right.
Like I just do.
No one will ever convince me, though, that the neoconservatives didn't believe everything they were saying. Like, I don't think they were ever even cynical. I think most of them believed it.
He's a figure against the concepts of great men that make history. Yeah, but yes and no. I don't want to explicate him, just like I don't want to explicate Stalin. Um,
I'm not saying Eisenhower is the Antichrist either.
no.
You know, I mean, I'm glad he gave that speech. I think it was invaluable in some ways, but then again, I mean, has it really done much to stop the military-industrial complex?
No.
But
Like, what did the peace movement give us? Some boomer music. Yeah, I mean, it's, I tried to end it earlier on. I'm not being blackpilled, because I'm not. I actually think blackpilling is a cop-out.
Mhm.
I think, like, what the actual task at hand is to look at the things the quote black pillers do. Look at them honestly, admit that 90% of them are true, and that depressive state of the world is real, and still go, we have stuff to do. All right.
Right.
We have no idea how to do it. And anyone who tells you that they know is either probably drinking their own Kool-Aid or trying to sell you something.
Yeah.
But it doesn't absolve you from the responsibility, because if we don't, and I'm not saying this in like we have to just act and do actions, because that can be counterproductive. That can make things worse. But if you just absolve yourself, well, I mean, a lot of people did in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah. They washed their hands like Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, that's kind of how we got here.
Right.
That's why things were allowed to go on autopilot for so long. I mean, it's kind of weird. Like, we've been the world hegemon, and since we've been the world hegemon, like, we got 10 years of like being awash in super profits and the post-war social compact, right? You got it from like 1948 to like 1961. We've been kind of spiraling in various directions, not just in the United States, but most explicitly so, the entire rest of the time. And yet we still managed to, like, I don't know, out-survive the Soviets and, like, watch the Chinese
people
completely
forget the
change
70s weren't the
direction.
nicest time, were they?
Yeah, I mean, like, black pilling is a real thing. It is a real thing because it's overwhelming. Trying to hold, like, okay. Let me put it another way. Psychological study after psychological study has indicated that people who are depressed are actually more likely to be right about their situation.
Depressive realism.
Right. Depressive realism. But also, they're more likely to feel unable to do anything about it and die or kill themselves. So what does depressive realism get you if you succumb to it, right? Like, but it's really hard.
So basically really what you're saying is we must become as Sisyphus. Imagine ourselves rolling the boulder up the hill and it always coming down and still being happy.
No, I think no. Imagining yourself still being happy is probably like
it's probably not a good idea.
It's probably not a good idea. Yeah. I think that there's a difference between thinking the world is beyond comprehension and thinking there's nothing we can do. I also think we need to look at we need to the person when you're trying to act to change the world, the person that you actually need to challenge the most, oppose after your enemies or whatever. But as far as your understanding of the world, and the most effective people who actually have had world historic effects have done this is yourself, but in a way that doesn't undermine your public facingness. So like I have apparently sucked at this because I have definitely undermined my public facingness by being entirely too honest about some of the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But the people who kind of understand really, like, you read like stuff about Zhou Xilai and who's like a real hero of the Chinese Communist movement in a lot of ways. He's got some dark night of the soul stuff in journals. He just does. All right. I've always wondered what we would learn if like Lenin kept an honest diary. And there were reasons actually why public figures made sure that didn't happen.
Right.
But in the past. about 100 years ago, there was another global economic crisis with a divergence between perceived base and superstructure. Um, I wish people wouldn't reify metaphors so much, but yes, there was. But the perceived outcome of that the people who saw that thought was going to happen, which was, communism. That's what that's what the predictors of that thought, did not happen.
Mm-hmm.
That when people talk, when right wingers talk about the spinning of they come up with these weird cultural conspiracy theories, cultural Marxism, Judeo-Bolshevism, etc. But there is a truth in the fact that Marx predicted the end of capitalism in 1850.
Mm-hmm.
Grossman did in 1930 something. The Soviet Union said it would happen probably by. Trotsky said it was going to happen by the middle 50s.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the truth that we saw, the economic crisis that was there, and have been historically verified, did not lead to the outcome that they thought it was going to happen. So apparently the perception, or even acting on that base, is not enough. My Gramsci theory though is really for people who don't know, I'm going to end the podcast here. I was trying to present Gramsci fairly in that video that I released at Theorizing with a Hammer today.
I know that's very hard for you, Derek.
It's real hard. And I'm gonna have to do it with Althusser and Jameson in the next few weeks too. And I gotta swallow my opinions because I just have to teach you what these theories are. Because in some ways they don't have a better theory. I mean, there actually are. There's points of Gramsci's ideas that even I think have something to them, but 1,000 years of long march. 1,000 years. The Gramsci moment led a lot of the left to go through the institutions and actually think, okay, if we can't push the vanguard parties into the factories, maybe we can take the factory workers into the colleges, because that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
All right. How has that turned out for us? Anyway, thank you, JG, for letting me rant for more than half of our mutual interview. Which I think I ranted more on my show interviewing you than I do on your show interviewing me. We didn't actually talk about alternatives at all.
You'll have to have me back on to just talk about podcasting. I know that's originally what we wanted to do, but I think Afghanistan sidelined that.
Yeah, you said it though off air that this was a weirdly prescient moment for us to just accidentally do this, right? Because you and I have
it's a pretty surreal moment for me. I remember when the Afghan war started, and I remember I think I was very reactionary when 9/11 happened, because I was just a little kid, right? I was
you were 14?
Fourth grade.
Yeah, I was a junior in college.
So. Right. So, but the thing for me was I very quickly became critical of the war on terror after about maybe a year.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a surreal thing to see. Oh, we're out of Afghanistan. It's over. It's finally over.
Part of me is I can't believe it's over, and part of me doesn't really believe. We have all these things that are going to be blowback for another maybe century if we survive that long. But at the same token, it is this it's the irony of being a professional activist, or even maybe a professional revolutionary. If you ever win, what do you do? Now, we didn't win. Right. This just happened.
Right.
The Taliban won. But just like the anti-war movement in the U.S. didn't win, the People's Army of Vietnam won. But what do you do? Because in some ways, this foundational issue that got me involved in this in the first place is not an issue in the same way anymore. And
Yeah, I
yet,
mean, I think it was very defining for both of us. You know?
yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about. I mean, you and I were just. I thought we were originally when I was. I thought we were going to talk about like, well, we thought there was going to be some alternative culture, and then things got shittier. Sorry,
Right.
like that was the way I thought this conversation was going to go. It was going to be like an hour, like, and it
Yeah,
was
I
going
mean,
to be mostly.
it could have been much more depressing if we went that route.
Yeah, actually, just like, boo, the discourse. Twitter sucks. I mean, but like we all know that.
Right?
Um, and yet we all still addicted to Twitter. But this moment was bigger for me, and I'm still angry about it. I didn't actually until I talked to you, JG. I wasn't. I've been kind of down all day, and
Mhm.
then when I started talking about this, I felt all this like years of rage. Come on. I mean, because
See, I feel like your rage is more directed. This is interesting. And I know we keep going over, but I don't know. I feel like my rage is more directed at the sort of center that gave us this, you know, the sort of liberal center. Whereas I think you're more focused on the left because you were so involved in left activism.
Right. I think that's a lot of it. And I also think I never expected anything of the liberal center ever in the first place. I always thought they sucked.
Right.
Like,
well, like, I'm not saying you're wrong about that necessarily.
Like, I kind of hated them even when I remember when I was writing zines as a 16-year-old, right? And then realizing that, like, I think Clinton's a war criminal and he destroyed the welfare state. Not that we really had one.
I guess my anger is just at how, like, it just feels opportunistic when, I've had people say, because, I've been more and more open about, I essentially supported the withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had one or two guests, did not support a full withdrawal, which is fine. I'm willing to listen to different sides of the debate. But I was very supportive of the withdrawal. And there's people that would come up to you and say, like, what about the women and the children? And I don't know. I can't take that crap anymore.
I love children. All right. I literally, this is my
day
job.
Where were these people when we killed Gaddafi and released? I mean, not to sound, I know right wingers will bring this up and Pat Buchananite types, but I mean, is Libya any better now?
No, hell no. Oh,
yeah. I mean,
no.
The death of Gaddafi brought around, the return of the sex trafficking. All this, it's a mess. Where were these people? Do they care about the women and the children oppressed in Saudi Arabia? Well, why does Saudi get the state of exception? Oh, because they're an ally. So I've been very frustrated with, like, just the
I'm
more
tell you,
posturing.
I actually got to say, even when I hear it from leftists, when I hear people talk about children in particular, I'm always like, I don't believe you. I don't believe you give a shit about kids. Like unless you're doing something actively to help them, whenever you bring it up, it's usually to justify something else because it's the easiest appeal in the world because we all have compassion for children.
Well, it's just I keep coming back to that. Like, where were these people? Where are these people with Saudi Arabia? Where are these people with what happened with Libya? Where I'm sick of being morally talked down to by people.
Where are these people with kids in their own goddamn country?
Well, yeah, that's a good damn point, ain't it? I mean, I'm sick of that's the thing I get most mad about with sort of the center is I'm not gonna I refuse to stand for this kind of like finger wagging. I mean, I know you have sort of you have issues with Norman Finkelstein and some of the things he said recently on things like This Is Revolution. But there was that interview he did on TrueAnon where he was, I popped really hard when I heard him talk about like the people in Martha's Vineyard, right? He was talking about all these people supported Alan Dershowitz, a guy who defended wife beaters, wife killers. And then when the Epstein stuff comes out, now screw him. They didn't say screw him when he went out when all the stuff with Finkelstein was going on, because they were thinking to themselves, oh, well, Finkelstein, he's the third-rate college. We're going to keep supporting Dershowitz. And he called them, sacks of shit. and that's how I feel about the center at this point. I'm very just, I probably shouldn't say that because I have friends that are centrists, but I'm sick of being finger wagged at by people that are completely incoherent on pretty much everything. Everything is just alliances of convenience. And oh well, this country can do it because they're an ally. This country can't, and everything's just a mess. And I'm really tired of the moral. I don't even know what you call it. Just the posturing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, totally.
Sorry for ranting, but I felt like I needed to rant for a second to get that off my chest.
You've heard it. I've been ranting for longer than you, and you're the interview subject. But the one thing I will say about that, to some degree, I laugh when you bring up Finkelstein, because for all of my complicated emotions about Finkelstein, and I don't want to talk about it, but why I have them, and it's not necessarily what he said. And we'll leave it at that. I will say that I've hated Alan Dershowitz for a lot fucking longer. This is I'm gonna tell you this story. The year I got into my MFA, and it was 2005, I got invited into an honors fraternity, and I probably should have taken it, right? Like I don't have a lot of connections because I'm working class, and this would have enabled me to get more. But you know why I didn't take it?
Right.
Do you know? Could you guess?
Why? Alan Dershowitz?
The first event was for me to meet Alan Dershowitz as a speaker. And I had recently read Sam Harris's The End of Faith.
Right.
And all I could imagine doing to Alan Dershowitz was spitting on him.
That's how I felt when my teacher, when I went into the media studies program at my university, he was like, "We're going to read stuff like The Lexus and the Olive Tree by Thomas Friedman," and I just threw the book down. It's like, no. But go on.
But all that aside, I think Finkelstein's point is totally valid, and I can totally admit when someone has an amazing point. I mean, by the way, I still tell people to read The Holocaust Industry.
Right.
It is an eye-opening book.
Right.
That has not been changed by the last 20 years.
Right. I think that's the most frustrating thing, though. We'll leave it at this. I saw John Dolan made a comment about the Afghanistan situation today, and I have a lot of respect for John. He said, for everyone that doesn't know, that's the war nerd. So
yeah, I have a lot of respect for John too. By the way, I mean,
a brilliant poet too, by the way. But he said, they lied. Look at all this chaos that is happening now in the Middle East, and no heads are going to roll. And that's what gets me the most upset about it. I'm like, 20 years in Afghanistan, and it feels like
trillions
for what?
Of dollars,
trillions of dollars. Yeah, and people say,
thousands dead, probably millions of.
Someone said to me recently, "You sound like the angry white man." Because I was talking about the Saudi 9/11 lawsuit with the victims' family members. I've talked to the victims' family members and stuff, and it's like, yeah, I am angry about it, and I'm sick of this. We're not supposed to be angry. We have to play it cool with everything. No, if you're not pissed, you ain't alive anymore. So that's how I feel. And I'm just tired of, maybe I'm just bitter that I got lied to. I think a lot of people just are bitter over feeling like they got lied to. It's like you think that, if you do all the right things, everything will end up okay. And then you realize, oh crap, people like Dershowitz are where they are because they just knew the right people and they were just a stupid fourth string lawyer for what's O.J. Simpson. And it's like, I think that's what debilitates people the most. Maybe that's why people are black-pilled. We got sold on meritocracy, right? And some people bought it. And then when they find out it's not true, they're like, oh, well, now what?
Yeah. Well, wait till they discover that it can't be true because wealth actually does really give you advantages that are objective beyond.
Right.
Beyond
there's certainly people that have it worse for me, worse than either of us, so we have our own advantages. Yeah.
I'm an objectively privileged. I got to travel the world on someone else's dime. Of course I'm privileged. I got the con education companies and the world's rich.
Right.
All right. And when I say the world's rich, the people who employed me when I was abroad had the money in a developing world country to spend more than the yearly salary of most of the people in that country for 1 year of education, and they did it in USD, even though it was hard to get.
Right.
I'm privileged. All right. But I didn't always live that way. And actually how I got that was help and an accident.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I do think we should be like, as a last note, this will get on my war on JD Vance instead of my ambivalence about Finkelstein and, stuff that I don't really want to bring out to the public.
Have you been following the latest stuff with Vance?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, 10 million to be the Peter Thiel candidate and supplicate himself to Trumpism. And you know what's funny about it? He's still going to lose, which is hilarious.
You know what's even funnier about it? Grim Greenwald called him an anti-imperialist, which made me fall over laughing.
Right.
Right. But whatever. Some people let their resentment at how bad the Democrats suck totally dominate their lives. But anyway,
I don't know how to respond to that. JD Vance, anti-imperialism.
Yeah, JD Vance makes me angry. It makes me angry because on one hand,
he ain't as Appalachian poor as he likes to make himself out to be. First off.
Yes, I know he's actually Rust Belt, lower middle class. But that's not the whole hillbilly shit. Okay, that's affectation. But the actual book, the hillbilly thing is like some weird cultural affectation. What he mostly writes about is, two socioeconomic steps down from you, JG, on the ladder, and their dysfunctions. And he writes about it honestly until he editorializes about it totally dishonestly. But you know what he doesn't? You know what he's not honest about?
What's that?
How he got to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how?
No, go on.
He got when he went into the military, which is how he paid for college, he was lucky. He got a POG position, non-grunt military, I think counterintelligence, but didn't require you to be an officer. And that got him into the purview of an Ohio state senator, who helped him get into things he got into later on. And he does not mention any of that in his little meritocracy book. All right.
Yeah.
It'd be like me pretending that it was my awesome goodwill and my amazingness that got me to travel around the country.
He speaks a lot these days with I know he spoke once with Charles Murray, which I found very interesting because I thought him and Murray had like diametrically opposed views as to why. Well, Charles Murray's whole thing, and it's weird, people don't really include this in their analysis of the bell curve, but it is part of the bell curve. He like Charles Murray just has a hate boner against the Scotch Irish, right? He looks at Appalachians as just being genetically.
He sees them as genetically inferior. Weirdly,
whereas
a lot of liberals, the liberal internal nation theories, which was posited from a Democratic period, has the same fucking theory.
But that's what's interesting about him speaking with Vance, because it's like, well, wait, I thought Vance was the guy that was saying, oh, it's not genetics, it's not IQ, it's just that we need to stop being such cultural degenerates. Now they're speaking together, and now he's a Trumplican, so it figures.
It's just it's what it is. But my only point about that is, like, when you meet a working class person who has had advantages and they don't admit it, they're probably kicking the ladder on their way up.
Right.
I've had advantages. I've had help. I come from generations of dirt farmers on one side of my family, but if I'm completely honest, the other side of my family is a lot more split.
Right.
And I actually kind of hate when people on the socialist left do the whole I'm not PMC because I was raised in West Virginia and you lived with my grandma and we grew up poor, even though there's probably other things going on, and you went to a top tier school. And
that's what's so weird about the moment we're in too, because like culturally, and we'll get into this in another episode maybe, but it's weird. I think authenticity has been a currency of sorts, traditionally for people that were lower on the socioeconomic ladder. But the people at the top of the ladder had to steal that from them too. So now everyone acts like they came from nothing. People, you read about people at Harvard, at Yale, that will say, "Oh, I'm not second generation. I'm first generation. I'm not like fourth generation." They'll try to hide it. And it's like, we even had to take this idea of authenticity and steal that from, I don't want to say the downtrodden, but you know what I mean? Like we stole everything. We've extracted everything that could be extracted culturally. So.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree. And on that note, we're now 45 minutes longer than we said we are. We've said fake goodbye.
Can I plug my show real quick?
Of course you can.
Okay, so Parallax Views at podbean.com. It's parallaxviews.podbean.com. Also the Patreon, patreon.com/Parallax Views. I'm currently in a situation where I'm taking care of a relative, so any support on the Patreon would help me. I don't like begging, but I would appreciate that. I'm doing a series on Afghanistan. I have Richard Falk coming on, Doug Bondow, which I don't know if your listeners will like Doug Bondow because he works at Cato, but he also writes for antiwar.com, so I like the guy, at least on foreign policy issues. And I have a bunch of other people coming on. Hopefully Trita Parsi from Quincy is coming on my show, doing a whole series on Afghanistan.
Can I give you some advice?
What's that?
Don't undersort yourself because of the ideological orientation of parts of your
That's true. I have the weird. I swear to God, I have the weirdest audience.
You do. You have outright reactionaries as fans, but you know what? Like, and you also have super tankies and anarchists and liberals, and you have centrists, which is wild. But you're trying to do journalism,
right? I mean,
as a podcaster, is rare.
I think most people are just trying to do I want to do one podcast a week and make it a comedy podcast, and I just talk to my friends while we're drunk, which I totally get the appeal of that. But
if anyone ever fucking calls me a comedy podcast, I'm gonna shank them.
I will get comedic. The last thing I wanted to say, and then you can totally cut this off. I've plugged my show and all that, and since we talked about Afghanistan a lot, I just have one final note. Fuck Max Boot.
Well, yeah, of course. Fuck Max. Yes, of course.
Just end it there. Fuck Max Boot.
Yeah, and also Kissinger. And yes, we're stopping there.
Oh, yeah.
Max Boot and Kissinger could suck it. This is the official stance of this podcast.
That's one of the there are very few people that I will come out and be like, I hate them. Max Boot is one, and the other one, we'll talk about Barry Weiss one day since she's the disgrace of my hometown. But
oh yeah, and she really likes the person I'm writing a book on. Yeah. Anyway, that good night. I'm probably gonna release this in 2 parts because this is a super long episode. I'm not gonna be on air this week again. I will have a Patreon episode coming up. Thank you, my patrons, for being patient with me. I hope you enjoy the archives and the additional stuff. My streams lately have been coming from my heart, so they've been free. I feel weird charging for them when I think everybody needs to hear what I have to say. Ironically, though, I also feel like I've been kind of shorting my patrons with only giving them archive material. Hey, by the way, JG,
the podcaster's dilemma.
Yeah, JG. They've been, you know this, but just so my listeners know, if you want more of what we tried to do together for Zero Books way back in the day, when JG and I actually had a ongoing podcast that was like this all the time. Well, not all, it's like twice a month. I've released most of the old episodes on my Patreon because they've been lost in Zero Books. You can probably find them if you dig through years and years and years of stuff over there at Zero. But
God, I still remember when we did the Taibbi episode.
Yep,
times have changed.
Oh boy, I actually maybe we
Taibbi part 2. That's what we'll have to do.
Taibbi part 2 and be like, hey, you know all that stuff we said when we defended him? I don't mean it anymore. I mean, it's funny because I think condemning our, I think playing into that parasocial. Anyway, I'm gonna shut the fuck up. All right. And then, the problem with this, JG, as the last comment, we actually enjoy talking too damn much. Like,
Right. Well, that's true.
um,
I got my fuck Max boot line in, so I'm happy.
yeah, I'm gonna let it end on that a second time. All right.